Imagine stepping out into the blinding heat of a midsummer afternoon in the year Tamjambemi. Across the rolling hills and fertile plains of what we now know as France and Germany, millions of peasant families are looking toward their fields with a sense of profound relief and anticipation. For months they have sweated under the unforgiving sun, clearing rocks, tilling the stubborn earth, and tending to the vast golden stalks of wheat that stretch as far as the eye can see. This is the heart of the historic Carolingian Empire, a land split into West Francia and East Francia, yet deeply bound by a shared absolute reliance on the soil. In the 9th century, the upcoming summer harvest is not merely a matter of economic prosperity. It is the thin, fragile line between survival and absolute starvation. The granaries are nearly empty from the grueling winter before, and every single soul, from the poorest serf to the highest noble, is counting down the days until the harvest begins. The air is heavy, still, and filled with the deceptive peace of a normal summer day. But then, without warning, the entire atmosphere shifts. It begins with a faint, low vibration humming through the earth, a tremor so subtle that many mistake it for the distant rumbling of an approaching thunderstorm. Yet, when the peasants look up, there are no storm clouds in sight. The sun is still blazing brightly in a clear blue sky. Within minutes, that faint rumble escalates into a deafening rhythmic roar. It is a sound so overwhelming that it defies description, like thousands of heavy iron chariots rushing down a rocky mountain slope, or the relentless, violent crashing of a stormy ocean wave against a cliffside. Farmers drop their wooden tools, their breath catching in their throats as they teu-ro-no their eyes toward the eastern horizon. What they witness next freezes the blood in their veins. A monstrous pitch-black wall of shadow is rising from the east, rapidly crawling across the sky like an ink stain spreading over silk. It moves with a terrifying, unnatural speed, swallowing the daylight inch by inch. Within moments, the brilliant afternoon sun is completely choked out, plunged into an eerie, artificial night. A sickly, suffocating twilight descends upon the vast agricultural heartland of Europe. But this is no solar eclipse, nor is it a trick of the weather. As the massive shadow draws closer, descending toward the earth, the horrifying truth becomes painfully clear: the cloud is alive. It is a swirling, churning, suffocating mass of billions upon billions of ravenous, migratory locusts. This was the dawn of the great locust swarm of Tambemi, a catastrophic ecological invasion so sudden, so absolute, and so unrelenting that it would completely obliterate the entire agricultural foundation of two massive medieval empires in just 72 hours. These were no ordinary grasshoppers. Ancient monastic chronicles, meticulously penned by terrified monks in the isolated scriptoriums of the Carolingian world, describe these creatures as monsters of an unnatural size, possessing a predatory aggression never before witnessed in Christian Europe. They were an unstoppable airborne army travelling on the high winds, driven by a singular, insatiable urge to consume every single ounce of organic matter in their path. As the terrifying vanguard of this infinite swarm finally descends upon the edges of the pristine golden fields, the true nightmare begins. The survival of Western Europe hangs in the balance, completely defenceless against a foe that cannot be fought with swords or shields. The channel The Dog and the Veteran is a storytelling platform created for entertainment, inspiration, education, and the promotion of positive emotional values. The sheer physical reality of the invasion was unlike anything Western Europe had ever experienced. As the massive cloud dropped from the upper atmosphere, it split into countless smaller but equally dense columns, each targeting a specific valley, village, or sprawling monastic estate. When the first wave of locusts hit the ground, the sound was described by chroniclers as a terrifying clicking patter, resembling a torrential downpour of heavy hailstones hitting the dry summer earth. But these were not frozen drops of water, they were living, breathing engines of destruction. Each insect was reported to be abnormally large, far larger than any native grasshopper the local peasants had ever seen. Their bodies were heavily armoured, their mandibles strong enough to slice through tough fibrous plants with terrifying ease, and their eyes glassy and vacant, focused only on the primal urge to eat. Within seconds of landing, the golden landscape began to dissolve. The locusts did not merely nibble at the leaves, they attacked the plants with a frantic, systematic savagery. A single field of wheat which had taken months of back-breaking labor to clear, cultivate, and protect from weeds and weather was completely stripped bare in a matter of minutes. The insects started at the very top, devouring the heavy grain-bearing ears of wheat first before working their way down the stalks. They chewed through the tough golden stems, leaving nothing behind but jagged, hollow stumps protruding from the bare earth. The speed of their consumption was so fast that eyewitnesses claimed you could actually watch the green and gold of the earth vanish before your very eyes, replaced by a carpet of shifting brown and grey bodies. Before we witness the desperate and futile defense mounted by the people of the Carolingian Empire against this unstoppable force, if you are captivated by these deep dives into history's most dramatic and forgotten catastrophes, please take a brief moment to support us. Hit that subscribe button, give this video a thumbs up, and turn on the notification bell. Your incredible support helps us bring these powerful, immersive historical narratives to life, and we would love to have you as part of our growing community of history enthusiasts. As the sun remained completely choked out by the swirling masses above, a profound psychological terror gripped the population. In the 9th century, science as we know it did not exist to explain the sudden mass migration of insects from distant lands. To the medieval mind, an event of this terrifying magnitude could mean only one thing: the wrath of God. The sky had turned to darkness at midday, and a plague of biblical proportions was eating the very food out of their children's mouths. Church bells began to toll frantically across the countryside, their metallic clanging mixing with the horrifying collective buzzing of billions of mandibles. Priests rushed to their altars, falling to their knees and crying out for mercy, while frightened peasants threw themselves into the dirt, weeping and praying for deliverance from Te they truly believed was the beginning of the apocalypse, the literal end of the world. As the initial wave of shock and religious terror slowly transformed into a desperate instinct for survival, the people of the Carolingian Empire realized they could not simply sit by and watch their entire livelihood vanish. From the smallest agrarian hamlets to the fortified castles of regional dukes, a chaotic, spontaneous mobilization began. Local lords, who usually commanded their soldiers to fight against rival human kingdoms or invading Viking raiders, suddenly found themselves ordering their men into a completely different kind of warfare. But how do you fight an army that numbers in the billions? How do you strike down an enemy that is too small for a sword to pierce, yet too vast for the mind to fully comprehend? The first tactic deployed across the sweeping valleys of France and Germany was an assault of sound, based on ancient folklore, and a frantic collective hope that the insects could be frightened away. Thousands of villagers poured into the fields carrying anything that could make noise. Peasants banged furiously on metal pots, heavy iron frying pans, and wooden buckets. Soldiers stood on the edges of the fields, rhythmically beating their heavy war drums and clanging their iron shields together in a rhythmic, deafening cadence. Church wardens tugged frantically on ropes, ringing massive bronze church bells for hours on end without a moment's rest until the metal grew hot and the bell ringers collapsed from sheer exhaustion. The countryside echoed with a chaotic, maddening symphony of human desperation. Yet the ravenous invaders remained completely unaffected. The collective mechanical buzzing of billions of locust wings and chewing mandibles was so overwhelming that it easily drowned out the frantic noise made by the human population. The insects did not scatter, they did not even pause, they simply kept eating. Realizing that noise was entirely useless, the desperate populations turned to a more aggressive element: fire. Working with a frantic speed born of pure panic, communities banded together to create massive, miles-long defensive barriers of smoke and flame. Men, women, and children rushed to clear brushwood, piling up mountains of dry timber, damp straw, and green leaves along the borders of the remaining unravaged fields. They ignited these barriers, creating towering walls of fire and sending thick, choking plumes of black smoke billowing into the sky, hoping to create an impenetrable sensory shield that would force the swarm to alter its course. For a brief, agonizing moment, it seemed like it might work. The leading edge of the swarm hesitated, swirling wildly above the heat. But the sheer, overwhelming mass of the Locust army quickly shattered that fragile hope. Driven by an insatiable collective hunger, the millions of insects behind pushed the front lines forward. Millions of locusts flew directly into the roaring flames and thick smoke. They rained down into the trenches, their bodies crackling in the heat. But there were simply too many of them. The infinite weight of the incoming swarm literally smothered the fires. The sheer volume of falling insect bodies crushed the flames, suffocating the embers until the fires were completely extinguished under a thick, squirming carpet of living and dead locusts. The smoke screens cleared and the unstoppable tide rolled right over the ashes, moving into the untouched crops with an even greater ferocity. Peasants tried to physically fight the creatures, using heavy woolen cloaks, willow branches and brooms to swat frantically at the air and the ground. But for every 100 locusts a desperate father managed to crush beneath his boots or strike down with a branch, 10,000 more landed around him. The insects crawled up the legs of the soldiers and peasants, covering their clothes, tangling themselves in their hair, and biting at their exposed skin in their frantic search for more food. Men fell to their knees in the middle of their ruined fields, weeping openly as they realized the absolute futility of their strength. The grand armies of East and West Francia, capable of holding off empires, were utterly powerless against the smallest of nature's creatures. To truly understand the terrifying efficiency of the great locust swarm of Tambay Bar, one must look closely at the chronological timeline of those fateful 72 hours. It was a masterclass in ecological devastation, executed with a systematic precision that no human army could ever hope to replicate. When the sun rose on the first day of the invasion, the valleys of East and West Francia were vibrant, green, and bursting with life. By the time the sun set just 3 days later, the exact same lands were unrecognizable, transformed into a monochromatic, lifeless desert of grey and ash. On the first day, the swarm focused exclusively on the primary targets, the vast sweeping fields of cereal crops. Wheat, barley and rye were the lifeblood of the Midi-European economy and diet. The locust descended upon these fields in dense, miles-long sheets, moving like a living scythe across the land. They targeted the softest, most nutrient-rich parts of the plants first. The heavy ears of grain, swollen with the summer-esque moisture and ready for harvest, disappeared into billions of tiny, chewing mouths. By the end of the first 12 hours, the agricultural surplus of entire provinces had been completely liquidated. Where waving seas of golden grain had stood that morning, there was now only bare dark soil punctuated by jagged, broken stems. As the second day dawned, the sheer mechanics of survival forced the swarm to expand its appetite. Having entirely consumed the primary grain fields, the billions of insects began to move outward into the surrounding areas, targeting the secondary sources of food. They rolled over the carefully cultivated orchards of East Francia and the world-renowned sprawling vineyards of West Francia. The locusts stripped the fruit trees, apples, pears and plums of their leaves and their ripening fruit within minutes. Heavy clusters of grapes intended for the vital wine production of the monasteries were stripped clean, leaving behind nothing but bare, skeletal vines. Next, they invaded the private vegetable gardens of the peasants. Cabbages, onions, turnips and carrots were excavated and devoured right down to the topmost tips of their roots. The domestic food supplies that families relied on to supplement their daily bread were utterly erased. By the third day, the situation reached a level of surreal horror. The sheer density of the population meant that competition for food among the insects themselves became fierce. With all the soft vegetation completely gone, the locusts adapted, turning their powerful mandibles toward materials that no one thought insects could ever consume. They swarmed the dense European forests, climbing high into the ancient oaks and beech trees, devouring the tough leaves before systematically gnawing away at the bark of the branches. The trees were left completely white, their inner wood exposed to the elements, looking like ghostly skeletons standing under the summer sky. The hunger of the swarm was so absolute that they began to attack man-made objects. They descended upon the small villages, eating the straw thatching right off the roofs of peasant cottages, leaving families exposed to the weather. They chewed through wooden fences, leather tool straps, and even the linen and woolen clothing that peasants had left out to dry on bushes. When the 72 hours drew to a close, a heavy, suffocating silence fell over the lands of France and Germany. The deafening roar of the wings finally began to fade as the main body of the swarm, having completely exhausted the local resources, lifted back into the sky to seek new targets further west and south, but they left behind a landscape of total ruin. For hundreds of miles there was not a single green leaf, not a single blade of grass, and not a single ear of grain left standing. The vibrant, fertile heart of Western Europe had been stripped down to its bare bones, leaving the human population to stand in the quiet ruins of their world, facing an immediate and terrifying question: how would they survive the coming winter? In the wake of the 3-day devastation, the immense task of recording this unprecedented catastrophe fell to the only literate class of the era, the Christian monks. Tucked away within the thick stone walls of isolated monasteries across the Carolingian world, these scholars maintained detailed, year-by-year journals known today as the medieval annals. Written in formal Latin on expensive sheets of parchment, these documents provide a chilling, first-hand glimpse into the psychological and physical trauma experienced by the people of the 9th century. The ink penned by these terrified witnesses centuries ago still carries the weight of their absolute despair. Among the most vital historical sources for the year Tambay Bar are the Annales Fuldenses, the Annals of Fulda, recorded in one of the most powerful and influential monasteries of East Francia, located in modern-day Germany. The monk recording the events for that fateful summer describes the locusts not as simple insects, but as an invading force of supernatural proportions. According to his entries, the swarm possessed an internal discipline that mirrored a highly trained army. He writes with a sense of pure awe and terror about how the creatures travelled in perfectly formed massive columns, moving with a singular purpose. The Annals Fuldenses note that the insects were of a size never before seen in the region, and that their numbers were so vast that they could completely obscure the sun for hours at a time, plunging the earth into a cold, terrifying darkness that felt like a permanent eclipse. Further to the west, in what is now France, the Annales Bertiniani, the Annals of St. Bertin, provide a matching account of the devastation. The chronicler of St. Bertin focuses heavily on the absolute speed of the destruction and the unique physical characteristics of the pests. He records that the locusts possessed unusually long, powerful wings and large, hard mandibles that made a distinct rhythmic clicking sound as they chewed. The text paints a horrifying picture of the aftermath, noting that within just a few hours of the swarm's arrival in any given district, the entire landscape was rendered utterly barren. The Annales Bertiniani explicitly state that the insects did not just eat the grain, they consumed the very bark off the trees and the thatch from the roofs, leaving the human population with absolutely nothing to sustain themselves. What makes these monastic records so uniquely terrifying is the lack of any political bias or exaggeration for poetic effect. Usually, these annals were filled with short, concise notes about the deaths of kings, the outcomes of major battles, or the signing of treaties. Yet, for the year Tambay Bar, the entries regarding the locust invasion are unusually long, detailed, and deeply emotional. The monks felt compelled to describe the exact path of the swarm, noting its entry from the eastern borders, its progression through the heart of Germany, and its eventual descent into the valleys of France. Through these ancient Latin texts, we can perceive the immense existential dread that gripped the medieval mind. The chroniclers did not see this as a simple random event of weather or biology. To them, the locusts were a direct, physical manifestation of the plagues of Egypt, a literal warning from the heavens that society had fallen out of favour with the divine. The neat, precise handwriting of the monks often wavers in these sections, reflecting the physical exhaustion and emotional trauma of men who were watching their world fall into a dark, inescapable abyss of starvation right outside their monastery windows. With the departure of the locust swarm, the true agonizing scale of the economic and humanitarian disaster began to unveil itself. The immediate reaction of relief that the insects were gone quickly mutated into a cold, paralyzing dread. The autumn months, which should have been filled with joyous harvest festivals, community singing, and the rhythmic threshing of grain, were instead marked by a ghostly hollow silence. The granaries, which should have been overflowing, were kept to hat wheat and barley to sustain the population through the harsh medieval winter, stood completely empty. The stone walls of these storehouses, normally dusted Vekeptehat flour and filled with the rich, comforting aroma of harvested grain, were dry and barren. As we look closer at how this catastrophic shortage altered the course of European history, we want to take a quick moment to invite you to join our journey. If you find these historical deep dives heart educational and gripping, please consider sharing this video with a friend who loves history. Don't forget to leave a comment below telling us what you think about this incredible historical event. Your interactions truly help our channel grow and allow us to keep producing high-quality content for you. As the seasons shifted and the first biting frost of late autumn crept across the ruined fields of France and Germany, the basic laws of supply and demand triggered an unprecedented economic collapse. Grain, now rarer than precious gems, became a luxury that only the wealthiest elites could dream of acquiring. The price of a single bushel of wheat skyrocketed to astronomical, impossible heights. Wealthy merchants and unscrupulous hoarders who had managed to save small reserves from previous years exploited the crisis, demanding exorbitant sums of silver or the deeds to ancestral lands in exchange for a mere handful of flour. For the average peasant family who lived hand-to-mouth even in the best of times, these prices were an absolute death sentence. They had no silver to offer, and their land was all they possessed. The social fabric of the Carolingian world began to tear at the seams. Society was strictly divided into those who prayed, those who fought, and those who worked. But the famine proved to be a ruthless equalizer of human misery. Families were forced to make unimaginable choices just to see the next sunrise. Parents watched in absolute heartbreak as their children's faces grew gaunt and their energy faded. In a desperate bid to stave off the gnawing pain of empty bellies, people resorted to consuming things that were never meant for human digestion. They boiled wild weeds, dug deep into the frozen earth for bitter roots, and stripped the remaining bark off dead trees to grind into a coarse, tasteless powder to bake into a form of survival bread. The roads connecting the major towns and monasteries of East and West Francia became grim pathways of despair. Thousands of displaced peasants abandoned their useless, barren plots of land, wandering aimlessly in search of food. They flocked to the gates of local monasteries and the castles of regional counts, begging for a single scrap of bread or a drop of broth. But even the wealthy institutions were running dangerously low on provisions. The cold winter winds brought with them a wave of extreme winter weather that spared no one. Along the ditches and roadsides, the tragic reality of those who had succumbed to the hunger became a common sight, a testament to the total erasure of an empire's food supply. All stories presented on this channel are fictional and are creatively developed based on themes such as courage, loyalty, resilience, and the special bond between veterans and their dogs. The catastrophic aftermath of the Locust invasion did not just break the bodies of the peasants, it shook the very foundations of the Carolingian political structure. At this specific point in history, the vast empire once unified under Charlemagne had broken apart into competing factions. West Francia was ruled by Charles the Bald, while East Francia was under the control of Louis the German. These rulers were already deeply entangled in bitter geopolitical rivalries, constantly watching their borders for signs of brotherly betrayal, while simultaneously trying to defend their coastlines from the terrifying, unpredictable raids of the Vikings. Their military machines and administrative systems were entirely geared toward human warfare. They were completely unprepared to handle a systemic ecological collapse that recognized no borders, paid no taxes, and cared nothing for royal authority. In the 9th century, the concept of a state-sponsored humanitarian relief effort was completely non-existent. The kings did not possess vast centralized emergency granaries to distribute food to the starving masses during a famine. Royal wealth was measured in land, gold, and the loyalty of armed vassals, none of which could be eaten to stave off hunger. As the winter of Tambay-Bar deepened, both Charles the Bald and Louis the German found themselves trapped in a state of absolute administrative paralysis. The tax revenues of the kingdoms, which were heavily dependent on agricultural tithes, a percentage of the grain harvested by each estate, vanished into thin air. Without grain, the peasants could not pay their taxes to the local lords, the lords could not pay their dues to the counts, and the counts could not send wealth to the royal treasuries. The entire economic engine of Western Europe ground to a sudden, screeching halt. This economic freeze led directly to a severe breakdown of local law and social order. Across the desolate, grey landscapes of France and Germany, the traditional bonds of feudal loyalty began to disintegrate under the extreme weight of starvation. Local counts and dukes responsible for maintaining peace within their territories found themselves unable to control populations driven mad by the lack of food. Groups of desperate, dispossessed farmers banded together, roaming from village to village. They did not carry weapons of war or seek bloody confrontations, but rather searched frantically for any hidden caches of food, animal feed, or seed grain that might have escaped the jaws of the locusts. Even the strict, sacred laws of the Christian Church regarding property were ignored. Royal decrees from this period hint at a quiet, widespread breakdown of authority, where the sheer necessity of staying alive overrode all fear of legal punishment or royal wrath. Furthermore, the geopolitical vulnerability of the two kingdoms escalated dramatically. The Viking raiders, who had been terrorizing the river networks of Europe for decades, quickly realized that the Carolingian kingdoms were at their weakest point. However, even the raiders faced a strange paradox. There was little to no food left in the country for them to steal. This shared misery created an incredibly bizarre, hollow atmosphere across the continent. Empires that had projected power across Western Europe were now reduced to collections of isolated, starving fortresses, where kings and peasants alike could do nothing but look out across their barren lands, praying for the frozen ground to thaw, and wondering if their civilization would ever possess the strength to rebuild itself from the ashes of this invisible war. As the agonizingly long, dark winter of Tambay-Bar finally began to yield to the first faint warmth of the spring of Tambay II, the surviving population of the Carolingian Empire faced a completely new and unexpected environmental crisis. The melting of the thick winter snows did not reveal the fresh, vibrant green shoots of our awakening earth. Instead, as the white blanket receded, it uncovered a grim and surreal landscape. Layer upon layer of dead, decaying locust bodies lay trapped in the mud, victims of the sudden freezing winter temperatures that had caught the tail end of the swarm months prior. Billions of insect corpses, preserved by the winter freeze, were now exposed to the warming spring sun, initiating a massive, widespread process of decomposition that threatened the continent in a whole new way. The primary challenge of this new season was the sheer, unimaginable atmospheric pollution. Monastic records hint at a pervasive, suffocating stench that hung over the valleys of France and Germany for weeks on end. The smell of billions of rotting insects was so intense that it made working the fields nearly impossible for the physically weakened peasants. This biological mass did not just foul the air, it threatened the very water supplies that communities relied on for daily survival. Rainwater washed the decomposing organic material into local streams, shallow wells, and major rivers, turning vital water sources stagnant and toxic. The people, already deeply fragile from months of severe malnutrition, now had to contend with the immediate threat of waterborne illnesses, adding another heavy layer of misery to an already exhausted population. Yet, despite the immense physical weakness and the toxic environment, the primal drive to survive pushed the medieval peasants back onto the land. If they did not plant crops immediately in the spring of Tamchambaimi II, the upcoming winter would undoubtedly bring an absolute final extinction to their communities. This realization triggered an extraordinary display of human resilience and collective cooperation. Before any planting could even be conceptualized, the fields had to be painstakingly cleared by hand. Lacking any advanced machinery or chemical solutions, entire villages, composed of the old, the young, and the few remaining draft animals that had been consumed during the height of the famine, banded together to manually scrape, shovel, and clear the rotting biological debris from the agricultural plots. It was a grueling, back-breaking labor executed under the heavy cloud of an invisible environmental hazard. Once the soil was finally cleared down to the bare earth, the next monumental obstacle emerged: the absolute scarcity of seed grain. To plant a new crop, one must have saved a portion of the previous year's harvest to use as seed. But the locusts had eaten the crops, and the desperate hunger of the winter had forced families to consume even their most sacred, deeply hidden seed reserves. The agricultural cycle was broken at Motfit's very root. The search for viable seeds became a frantic, continent-wide treasure hunt. Local lords dispatched trusted messengers to distant, unaffected regions along the northern coastlines or deep into the mountainous zones of southern Europe, pleading to purchase or barter for any available sacks of grain. Monasteries opened their deepest, most secure stone vaults, distributing tiny, precious rations of saved seed to the surrounding tenant farmers, treating each individual grain of wheat like a priceless piece of gold. The future of Western European agriculture hung entirely on these few scattered handfuls of seed, planted with trembling hands into an uncertain earth. The summer of Tamcham Bami II arrived with a breathless, agonizing sense of anticipation that hung over the entire Western European continent. Every single eye, from the poorest landless serf to the most powerful regional duke, was permanently fixed on the newly tilled earth. The precious, scarce seeds that had been gathered through desperate interregional barter, royal pleading, and monastic charity were now buried beneath the soil. The survival of an entire civilization depended completely on what would happen over the next few months. The psychological trauma Loiepte behind by the previous year invasion was so profound that the social atmosphere remained incredibly tense. Every time a normal rain cloud appeared on the horizon, or a large flock of migratory birds flew over the valleys, panic would instantly ripple through the villages. People would drop their tools and run to the fields, terrified that the invisible army of the East had returned to finish what it had started. To minimize the terrifying risk of another total agricultural wipeout, the traditional landscape of Carolingian farming began to undergo a subtle but highly significant evolutionary transformation. The catastrophe of Tambay Bar had delivered a brutal, unforgettable lesson to the medieval mind. Relying almost exclusively on a monoculture of surface-dwelling cereal crops like wheat and barley was a recipe for absolute extinction. In response, communities began to organically diversify their agricultural strategies. Farmers started allocating a portion of their labor and land to cultivating root vegetables such as turnips, carrots, and wild radishes. Because these crops developed their nutrient-rich food sources safely beneath the surface of the earth, they were naturally insulated from airborne pests. Even if a future swarm were to strip the above-ground leaves, the vital food source buried in the soil would remain completely intact, providing a crucial, indestructible safety net against total starvation. Furthermore, there was a noticeable shift toward planting more resilient, rugged varieties of grain. Rye and oats, which were traditionally viewed as inferior crops, meant only for the poorest populations or animal feed, gained a new level of importance. These hardy grains could thrive in poorer soil conditions, grow faster, and possessed a natural durability that made them far more capable of recovering from partial insect damage compared to the delicate, prized stalks of wheat. This diversification was not driven by a sudden advance in botanical science, but rather by the pure, desperate instinct for survival. The medieval peasant was adapting his relationship with the earth, building a more complex, layered defense against the unpredictable whims of nature. When the very first green shoots finally broke through the dry crust of the earth in the late spring of Tamcham Bami II, the sight was met across France and Germany not with loud celebrations, but with tears of profound, quiet relief. These tiny green leaves were the physical proof that the earth was not permanently cursed, and that life was finally returning to a dead continent. Communities guarded these young, fragile plants with an almost military-like discipline. Children and the elderly were stationed along the edges of the fields from sunrise to sunset, tasked with making noise to scare away hungry birds, while the adults meticulously weeded the soil, ensuring that every drop of moisture and nutrient went directly to the survival of the crops. Any native, solitary grasshopper found near the fields was instantly destroyed, a testament to the lingering collective fear. By the late summer of Tambayu, the historic harvest was finally gathered. It was a meagre, modest yield, far smaller than the bountiful harvests of the decades before the plague, but it was enough. It was a harvest of pure resilience, providing just enough sustenance to ensure that the flame of Carolingian civilization would keep flickering through the next winter, forever changed by the great ecological storm. The generational trauma left by the great locust swarm of Tambay-Mibar extended far beyond the physical boundaries of the ruined crop fields or the immediate years of the Great Famine. For decades after the sky had finally cleared, a deep psychological shadow remained firmly anchored in the collective consciousness of the West and East Frankish populations. The children who had witnessed the terrifying midday eclipse of wings and felt the gnawing, desperate ache of winter starvation grew up into adults who viewed the natural world with a permanent sense of suspicion and vulnerability. The relative stability of life before Tambaimibar had been completely shattered, replaced by an acute awareness of just how quickly and completely the foundational pillars of human society could be brought to absolute ruin by the most unexpected forces of nature. This profound cultural trauma manifested heavily in the regional folklore, oral histories, and stories passed down through successive generations of farming families across France and Germany. Grandparents who had manually cleared the rotting biological debris from the fields in the spring of Tamchambaymai would sit by the hearth fire during cold winter nights, warning their grandchildren never to take a bountiful harvest for granted. In these spoken tales, the Locusts were often described as a disciplined mystical army sent from the unknown edges of the earth to test human endurance and humility. The rhythmic clicking sound of common grasshoppers in the summer meadows, which had once been a comforting, peaceful background noise of rural life, became a source of sudden anxiety, a lingering sensory trigger that could instantly transport an aging survivor back to the terrifying 3-day obliteration. Before we dive deeper into how this ecological catastrophe fundamentally altered the religious landscape and agricultural practices of medieval Europe, we want to pause and express our deepest gratitude to you, our incredible viewers. If you are captivated by these deep historical narratives of human survival against unimaginable odds, please take a quick moment to support our channel. Smash that subscribe button, leave a comment sharing your thoughts on this generational resilience, and give this video a thumbs up. Your active engagement is what keeps this channel running, allowing us to continue uncovering these powerful chapters of human history and sharing them with the world. Furthermore, this deep-seated anxiety began to subtly influence the structural choices of rural communities over the long term. The temporary nature of early medieval peasant dwellings, which relied heavily on soft organic materials like straw thatching and woven twig walls, was increasingly recognized as dangerously vulnerable to unique environmental threats. Where resources and geography permitted, there was a slow, gradual shift toward utilizing more durable, non-organic building materials for communal storehouses. Communities began to favor stone tiling or heavy wood shingles for their primary granaries instead of easily consumable straw, effectively creating structures that could better safeguard their remaining food supplies from future ecological challenges. The physical landscape of the European countryside was being remolded by the memory of a 3-day disaster, carving the hard lesson of Tambaimibar directly into the stone and timber of their homes. In the deeply pious worldview of 9th century Europe, an environmental catastrophe of this immense magnitude could never be interpreted as a mere freak accident of nature or a random biological anomaly. The line separating the material world from the spiritual realm was incredibly thin, almost non-existent to the medieval mind. Every weather pattern, every failed harvest, and every sudden plague was viewed as a direct readable message from the heavens, a divine commentary on the moral state of human society. Therefore, the devastating locust swarm of Tambibar was instantly interpreted by both the high-ranking ecclesiastical elite and the illiterate peasantry as a profound manifestation of divine wrath, a physical wake-up call meant to punish a sinful world and demand immediate, total spiritual repentance. The response from the Christian Church was swift, highly organized, and structurally massive. Bishops and abbots across West and East Francia declared extended periods of mandatory public fasting, prayer, and communal mourning. Communities that had barely survived the grueling winter hunger were instructed to deny themselves what little physical nourishment they had left for specific holy days, shifting their collective focus entirely from physical survival to spiritual purification. Massive, solemn penitential processions wound their way through the ruined grey countryside. Thousands of barefooted peasants dressed in coarse sackcloth and covered in soot and ash walked for miles behind local priests who carried gilded reliquaries containing the sacred relics of regional saints. The air, which had once been filled with the terrifying, mechanical buzzing of billions of locust wings, was now thick with the mournful chanting of Latin litanies as the desperate population cried out in unison, "A peste et fame libera nos, Domini, from plague and famine, deliver us, O Lord." This deep spiritual crisis led directly to a significant reallocation of wealth and land across the Carolingian kingdoms. Terrified that their personal sins, political rivalries, or greed had contributed to the total destruction of their community's livelihoods, many wealthy nobles and landowners sought frantically to appease the divine by making massive, unprecedented donations to the church. Fearing eternal damnation and the apocalyptic return of the swarm, regional dukes and counts signed over vast tracts of ancestral forests, fertile valleys, and entire agricultural villages to powerful, influential monasteries like Fulda, Saint-Denis, and Saint-Bertin. In exchange for these priceless properties, the aristocratic donors requested perpetual prayers for their souls and the spiritual protection of their remaining estates. This massive influx of land further solidified the economic and political dominance of the monastic network, making the church the largest and most secure landowner in Western Europe, a structural reality that would shape the continent's history for centuries to come. Moreover, the trauma of Tambe triggered a profound, permanent shift in the localized practice of faith and saintly devotion. Everyday people began to look for specific spiritual protectors who could safeguard them against the unique, unpredictable horrors of environmental collapse. Saints who were traditionally associated with agriculture, weather control, or protection against insect pests experienced a dramatic surge in popularity. Shrines dedicated to these specific holy figures became major centers of regional pilgrimage, drawing crowds of seekers who left behind their few remaining silver coins or handmade wax offerings in exchange for a formal blessing over their newly tilled fields. The collective memory of the swarm was being systematically institutionalized into the daily religious calendar, ensuring that the terror of those 3 days in the summer of Tamchambebar would be remembered not just as a historical event, but as a permanent, sacred lesson in human humility before the immense, untamable power of creation. The transformation of the great locust swarm of Tambe from an immediate, terrifying humanitarian disaster into a profound milestone in the history of Western Europe requires us to look beyond the immediate suffering of those 3 fateful days and examine the deep, structural shifts that occurred over the subsequent decades and centuries. When we look back at the early medieval period, traditional historical narratives often focus almost exclusively on the dramatic clashes of dynasties, the shifting borders of empires, the treaties signed by emperors, and the violent incursions of foreign invaders like the Vikings, the Magyars, or the Saracens. However, the silent airborne invasion of Tambe demonstrated with absolute clarity that the most powerful disruptive agent of historical change was not a human army marching vekeptehe iron spears and banners, but rather the fragile, volatile balance of the natural environment itself. The sudden entry of billions of migratory insects into the heart of the Carolingian world forced a complete reassessment of how human civilization interacts with the ecosystem, leaving a permanent legacy that would subtly influence European agriculture, administration, and scientific thought for generations to come. To fully comprehend the scale of this historical legacy, one must first explore how the catastrophe of Tambe fundamentally accelerated the development of what modern scholars call environmental history. For centuries, the events of that summer were treated by traditional chroniclers as an isolated supernatural anomaly, a freak occurrence of divine intervention that had no connection to broader environmental patterns. However, modern scientific advancements and interdisciplinary research have allowed historians, meteorologists, and biologists to piece together the fascinating, complex ecological puzzle behind the disaster. Through the analysis of ancient tree rings, ice core samples from Greenland, and localized soil sediment data, scientists have reconstructed the unique climatic conditions that characterized the late 9th century. The data reveals that the period leading up to Tambe was marked by intense climatic volatility across the Eurasian continent. A series of severe prolonged droughts in the vast open steppes of Eastern Europe and Central Asia had drastically altered the natural habitats of native insect populations. When these extreme droughts were suddenly followed by a period of unusual rapid warming and intense seasonal rainfall, it created the absolute perfect ecological storm for a biological explosion of unprecedented proportions. This unique combination of environmental factors triggered a fascinating and terrifying biological transformation within the locust species, a phenomenon known today as phase polyphenism. Under normal, stable environmental conditions, these insects exist in their solitary phase. In this state, they are completely harmless, reclusive grasshoppers that live isolated lives in sparse vegetation, avoiding contact with one another and causing no measurable damage to the surrounding flora. Their coloration is muted, blending seamlessly with the green and brown of the earth, and their daily energy expenditure is focused entirely on localized survival and reproduction. However, when sudden shifts in weather force these solitary insects out of their drying natural habitats and concentrate them into the few remaining fertile green valleys, their physical proximity to one another drastically increases. The constant, forced physical contact between the insects, specifically the continuous rubbing of their hind legs against one another as they crowd together for food, triggers a massive, rapid neurological reaction. Within a matter of hours, their bodies are flooded with an enormous surge of serotonin, initiating a complete radical metamorphosis. This chemical surge alters every single aspect of the insect's biology, behavior, and appearance. Their physical color shifts dramatically from a dull camouflage green to a bright, warning yellow and dark black, signaling their transition into the gregarious phase. Their brains physically expand to accommodate the complex sensory processing required for group coordination. Their muscles grow significantly stronger, and their wings elongate, transforming them into high-endurance endurance flyers capable of traveling hundreds of miles without rest. Most terrifyingly, their behavior undergoes a complete psychological shift. They lose all individual identity and merge into a single, highly coordinated, hyper-aggressive collective superorganism driven by an insatiable non-stop hunger. They begin to march and fly in perfectly aligned, massive formations, moving across continents like a living fluid wave that consumes every single piece of organic matter in its path. It was this highly evolved, unstoppable biological machine that crossed the eastern borders of the Carolingian Empire in the summer of Tambamibar, operating on an evolutionary defense mechanism that had been perfected over millions of years, completely indifferent to the political boundaries or religious defenses of human civilization. The long-term historical consequence of this biological explosion was a profound transformation in the way human societies managed their agricultural landscapes. Before the invasion of Tambamibar, the agricultural system of West and East Francia was heavily decentralized, relying on traditional localized farming techniques that had remained largely unchanged since the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. The absolute annihilation of the surface crops within 72 hours shattered the illusion that local communities could exist as completely isolated, self-sustaining economic islands. The realization that an environmental hazard originating thousands of miles away could instantly wipe out the entire food supply of Western Europe forced a slow, gradual shift toward greater regional integration and administrative oversight. Regional lords and monastic networks began to establish more robust and interconnected communication networks, creating early warning systems designed to track unusual weather patterns, mass insect sightings, or localized crop failures before they could escalate into continent-wide famines. Moreover, the recovery process after the famine of Tambamibar laid the foundational groundwork for the famous medieval agricultural revolution that would sweep across Europe in the 10th and 11th centuries. The forced diversification of crops, moving away from a fragile reliance on wheat toward a more resilient mix of root vegetables, hardy rye oats, and legumes, not only protected communities from future insect invasions but also significantly improved the overall health and nutritional stability of the European population. The introduction of these varied crops naturally enriched the soil with vital nutrients like nitrogen, preventing the tragic soil exhaustion that had plagued early medieval farming estates. The trauma of the Great Locust Swarm had accidentally acted as a brutal, unforgiving catalyst for innovation, forcing a conservative, tradition-bound agrarian society to adapt, evolve, and build a far more complex, multi-layered relationship with the Earth. Ultimately, the story of the Great Locust Swarm of Tambay stands as an enduring, timeless monument to the incredible, indestructible resilience of the human spirit. When we look back through the dark, sorrowful lens of the medieval monastic annals, it is easy to become overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the human misery, the crushing weight of the starvation, and the absolute helplessness experienced by millions of families as they watched their entire world turn to ash in just 3 days. Yet the true significance of this historical chapter lies not in the destruction itself, but in what happened after the shadow had lifted. Left with absolutely nothing but a barren, grey desert and a toxic, polluted environment, the surviving population did not surrender to despair or allow their civilization to collapse into total anarchy. They gathered what little physical strength they had left, unified across social classes and political divides, and manually rebuilt their entire agricultural infrastructure from absolute zero. They turned over the scarred earth, planted the few precious seeds they had searched the continent to find, and laid the foundations for a stronger, more adaptable, and infinitely more resilient Europe. The great ecological storm of Tambay had tested the very limits of human endurance, and though it broke the landscape, it ultimately forged a society that was capable of surviving the darkest challenges that the natural world could ever throw against it. For over 1,000 years, the catastrophic events of the summer of Tambay remained locked away within the fragile, fading pages of medieval Latin manuscripts, known only to specialized historians, monastic scholars, and dedicated archivists. To the rest of the modern world, the great swarm that had brought 2 mighty empires to their knees in a mere 72 hours was treated as a semi-mythical event. A tall tale told by superstitious 9th century monks who were prone to biblical exaggerations and apocalyptic fantasies. Because the primary physical evidence of the disaster consisted of organic materials, leaves, stalks, bark, and insect bodies, the passage of centuries completely erased the immediate visual scars of the destruction from the European landscape. The ruined fields were eventually replanted. The ghost-white forests regenerated their bark over decades of natural growth, and the billions of decomposing locust corpses dissolved into the earth, seemingly leaving no trace of their historic invasion for future generations to uncover. However, the advent of cutting-edge 21st century scientific technologies, interdisciplinary research methodologies, and advanced bioarchaeology has completely transformed our understanding of this forgotten catastrophe, revealing that the Great Swarm left a permanent, indelible physical signature written directly into the very soil, bones, and ecosystems of Western Europe. The first major breakthrough in physically validating the terrifying scale of the Tambay locust invasion came from the highly specialized field of palynology, the scientific study of ancient pollen and spores preserved within deep geological layers. Across the sweeping lowlands of modern-day Germany, France, and Belgium, environmental scientists and geologists extracted long, cylindrical sediment cores from undisturbed peat bogs, ancient lake beds, and deep river valleys. Peat bogs, with their unique acidic, oxygen-poor conditions, act as perfect natural time capsules, preserving organic matter with flawless precision for thousands of years. When scientists analyzed the microscopic pollen grains trapped within the specific soil layers corresponding precisely to the late 9th century, they discovered a sudden, dramatic, and unprecedented anomaly. Across hundreds of miles of geographic data, the normal steady concentration of cereal crop pollen, such as wheat, rye, and barley, abruptly dropped to near zero levels. This catastrophic agricultural collapse was accompanied by a simultaneous massive spike in charcoal dust and wild weed pollen, providing clear, undeniable physical proof of a sudden, widespread environmental trauma. The soil data perfectly mirrored the ancient monastic chronicles, demonstrating that the agricultural heartland of Europe had indeed been stripped entirely bare of its domestic crops within a single highly compressed window of time. As scientists dug deeper into these geological time capsules, they uncovered an even more profound piece of environmental evidence. The the chemical signature of the massive widespread decay that followed the winter of Tam Baimi Ba. When the billions of locusts died out due to the sudden onset of freezing winter temperatures, their bodies formed a thick, suffocating carpet of organic matter across the landscape. As the spring thaw of Tam Baimi 2 arrived, this unprecedented volume of insect biomass underwent a rapid simultaneous process of decomposition. Modern chemical analysis of the soil layers dating to this exact period revealed a sudden, extreme saturation of specific organic nitrates, lipids, and unique chitin derivatives, the tough, fibrous material that makes up the external skeletons of insects. This chemical footprint was so massive and concentrated that it could not be explained by normal seasonal variations in local insect populations. It represented a unique, highly localized ecological overload, confirming that an alien, migratory biomass of unimaginable proportions had suddenly landed, died, and rotted into the European earth, altering the chemical composition of the soil for decades to come. While the soil provided the ecological framework of the disaster, the most heartbreaking and intimate evidence of the human cost of the Tam Baimi Ba invasion was uncovered by physical anthropologists and bioarchaeologists working in early medieval cemeteries. Across rural France and Germany, the excavation of 9th century burial sites revealed a sudden terrifying shift in historical mortuary practices. In the layers corresponding to the winter of Tam Baimi Ba and the spring of Tam Baimi 2, archaeologists uncovered numerous mass graves. Long, hastily dug trenches containing dozens of skeletal remains packed closely together, buried without the traditional, individualized care that characterized medieval Christian funerals. These mass graves were not the result of violent warfare or military conflict, as the bones showed absolutely no signs of trauma from swords, axes, or arrows. Instead, the skeletons bore the unmistakable silent markings of a far more ruthless and indiscriminate killer: systemic, prolonged starvation. When anthropologists analyzed these skeletal remains using advanced X-ray technology and isotopic analysis, they discovered a profound pathological phenomenon known as Harris lines. Harris lines, also referred to as growth arrest lines, are distinct, dense bands of bone mineralization that form when a growing child or young adult experiences a period of extreme physical trauma, severe disease, or acute malnutrition that completely halts their physical development. When the individual manages to survive the trauma and growth resumes, a permanent visible line is left behind in the long bones of the body, acting as a permanent biological timestamp of their suffering. In the cemeteries of the Carolingian world, an astonishingly high percentage of the skeletons belonging to individuals who were children in the year Tam Baimi Ba exhibited these distinct Harris lines. Furthermore, analysis of the dental remains revealed widespread enamel hypoplasia, transverse grooves across the teeth caused by a complete disruption of enamel formation during early development due to a severe lack of nutrients. These skeletal and dental records provided a devastating, undeniable physical testimony to the immense human suffering that followed the Locust invasion, showing that an entire generation of European children carried the permanent, structural scars of the Great Winter Famine written directly into their very bones. The modern scientific rediscovery of the Great Locust Swarm of Tam Baimi Ba has also forced a major epistemological shift in how modern historians view the intellectual and technological capabilities of early medieval society. For generations, the 9th century was dismissed by many modern critics as a stagnant dark age characterized by absolute ignorance, blind superstition, and a complete lack of adaptive capacity. However, the multi-layered physical evidence of agricultural diversification, structural transformation, and administrative resilience that emerged in the immediate wake of the Tam Baimi Ba disaster paints a completely different picture. It reveals a deeply pragmatic, resourceful, and highly adaptable society that, when faced with an unprecedented ecological apocalypse that it possessed no scientific vocabulary to explain, was capable of executing complex long-term structural changes to safeguard its future. The story of Tam Baimi Ba, as reconstructed by modern science, is no longer just a narrative of tragedy and ruin. It is a profound testament to the enduring capacity of human civilization to analyze its vulnerabilities, adapt its relationship with the natural world, and emerge from the darkest environmental crises with a renewed, indestructible strength. To fully appreciate the historical magnitude of the Great Locust Swarm of Tambaimi Bar, it is essential to lift our eyes from the scarred valleys of West and East Francia and examine the event through a global planetary lens. The catastrophic biological invasion that unfolded across Western Europe was not a localized, isolated tragedy operating in a geographic vacuum. Instead, it was a dramatic symptom of a massive interconnected network of global climate anomalies that were fundamentally reshaping human history across the entire Eurasian continent during the late 9th century. The field of modern paleoclimatology has revealed that the year Tambaimi Bar fell within a highly volatile transitional phase of the Earth's climate history, the gradual, erratic shift toward what scientists define as the medieval warm period. This planetary climate shift was characterized not by uniform gentle warming, but by extreme unpredictable swings in temperature, prolonged continental droughts, and sudden, torrential monsoon failures that triggered widespread ecological disruptions from the Atlantic coast of Europe all the way to the empires of East Asia. During this specific decade in the late 9th century, historical records from across the globe reveal a fascinating and terrifying pattern of simultaneous environmental crises. In the Far East, the mighty Tang dynasty of China was entering its final chaotic decades of decline, a collapse that modern historians have directly linked to a series of severe multi-year droughts and catastrophic crop failures caused by a sudden shift in the Pacific monsoon patterns. These environmental disruptions led directly to widespread peasant rebellions, most notably the massive Huangchao Rebellion, which destabilized the imperial administration and pushed millions of citizens into starvation. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, the Abbasid Caliphate was grappling with its own unprecedented agricultural challenges, as shifting wind patterns and extended dry spells threatened the vital irrigation networks of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. When we synthesize these seemingly disparate historical data points, a profound realization emerges. The billions of migratory locusts that descended upon France and Germany in the summer of Tambaimi Bar were part of a massive continent-wide biological reaction to a planet in environmental flux. The extreme droughts in the vast Eurasian steppes had set off a domino effect of ecological displacement, forcing the native insect populations to undergo a rapid serotonergic transformation and march westward in a desperate instinctual search for moisture and green vegetation. To understand the sheer scale of the Tambaimi Bar European swarm, historians often utilize comparative history, matching the medieval descriptions against the well-documented megaswarms of the modern era. The most famous of these comparative events occurred in North America during the summer of Tambaimi Lum, an event known to science as Albert's Swarm. Sweeping across the western plains of the United States, this monstrous swarm of Rocky Mountain locusts was meticulously measured by early American scientists and meteorologists. The data they collected was staggering. The swarm was estimated to be roughly 10 miles wide and 10 miles long, covering an absolute geographic area larger than the entire state of California, and containing an estimated 9 trillion individual insects. Witnesses described the arrival of Albert's swarm in terms that directly echo the medieval Latin annals of Fulda and St. Burton, a deafening roaring sound like 1,000 freight trains, a sudden terrifying eclipse of the sun at midday, and the absolute total erasure of green fields, orchards, and tree bark within a matter of hours. However, while the physical dimensions of the Tambaimi Lum American swarm may have matched or even exceeded the great swarm of Tambaimi Bar, the relative socio-economic impact on human civilization was profoundly different due to the stark contrast in administrative infrastructure and technological development. In the 19th century, the United States possessed a highly advanced, industrialized transcontinental railroad network, a centralized federal government capable of organizing interstate relief, and access to global trade markets that allowed for the rapid transportation of emergency grain supplies from unaffected regions to the starving frontier communities. The American settlers faced severe economic ruin, but the systemic safety nets of the industrial age prevented a total demographic collapse. In stark contrast, the Carolingian world of Tambaimi Bar possessed absolutely none of these modern cushions. The societies of West and East Francia were completely decentralized, structurally fragile, and entirely dependent on the immediate, localized yield of their manual agricultural labor. When the Locusts stripped a medieval village bare, there were no trains coming to deliver emergency supplies, no global markets to stabilize food prices, and no centralized government to coordinate a humanitarian response. The 3-day destruction of Tambay-mi-Bar resulted in an immediate, inescapable descent into absolute widespread winter starvation, highlighting how the impact of an environmental catastrophe is defined not just by the physical power of the natural hazard, but by the structural vulnerability of the human civilization it encounters. This global comparative perspective elevates the narrative of Tambay-Bar from a simple, tragic footnote of medieval history into a profound universal lesson regarding the extreme fragility of human systems when confronted at planetary-scale biological anomalies. Throughout history, civilizations have built magnificent empires, organized powerful armies, and established complex legal frameworks operating on the comforting, dangerous illusion that they have achieved total mastery over the natural world. Yet the story of the Great Locust Swarm demonstrates at absolute clarity that the thin, fragile veneer of human order can be instantly torn apart by the smallest, most unexpected elements of the ecosystem. The modern world, with its hyper-connected global supply chains, massive industrial monocultures, and escalating climate volatility, remains uniquely vulnerable to similar, large-scale ecological disruptions. By studying the deep generational scars left behind by the invisible army of Tambay-mi-Bar, we gain a vital, humbling insight into our own relationship with the planet, reminding us that true civilizational resilience lies not in the arrogant defiance of nature, but in the deep, scientific understanding of its complex cycles and the deliberate, proactive protection of our shared human vulnerability. As our journey through the desolate valleys and hard-won triumphs of the late 9th century draws to its final conclusion, we are left standing on a profound vantage point of history, looking across a span of over 1100 years. The story of the Great Locust Swarm of Tambay-mi-Bar is far more than a simple tragic chronicle of medieval hardship or a curious footnote in the ancient annals of Europe. It stands as a monumental, timeless epic of civilizational vulnerability, environmental upheaval, and the unyielding, indestructible power of human resilience. When we trace the full, dramatic arc of this forgotten catastrophe, from that suffocating, quiet midsummer afternoon when a living eclipse swallowed the sun, to the absolute 3-day obliteration of the agricultural lifeblood of France and Germany, through the dark, agonizing winter of famine, and finally to the brilliant adaptive rebirth of the agricultural landscape, we witness the core elements of the human condition laid bare. We see a society stripped of its illusions, brought to the very brink of complete demographic collapse by an invisible airborne army, yet refusing to surrender its future to the dark abyss of despair. This extraordinary narrative fundamentally redefines our modern understanding of the early medieval period, shattering the long-standing simplistic myth that the so-called Dark Ages were a time of static, unthinking ignorance. The men and women who survived the crisis of Tambay-Bar demonstrated an incredible capacity for intellectual growth, structural adaptation, and deep communal solidarity. When their traditional worldview was shattered by an unprecedented ecological anomaly, they did not simply lie down in the dust and accept their fate as an unavoidable divine punishment. Instead, they adapted. They looked at the scarred, barren earth and found the pragmatic courage to diversify their crops, introducing root vegetables, resilient rye, and hearty oats to construct a multi-layered biological defense network that would safeguard future generations from similar catastrophes. They transformed a moment of absolute apocalyptic ruin into an unexpected catalyst for systemic innovation, laying the vital agricultural and administrative foundations that would fuel the great medieval renaissance of the centuries that followed. The modern, prosperous Europe we know today was built directly upon the hard-won lessons and the deep, fertile resilience forged in the ashes of that 3-day disaster. Furthermore, the legacy of the Tambay-mi-Bar swarm serves as a vital, deeply humbling mirror for our contemporary 21st century civilization. In our modern, high-tech world of automated industrial farming, genetic crop modifications, global satellite monitoring, and rapid intercontinental shipping networks, it is dangerously easy to succumb to the exact same illusion of absolute mastery over nature that blinded the ancient Carolingian kings. We look at our massive concrete cities and our complex global supply chains and believe that we have permanently insulated ourselves from the chaotic whims of the ecosystem. Yet the science of paleoclimatology and the historical reality of megaswarms remind us that the delicate balance of our planet remains just as volatile and just as interconnected as it was in the 9th century. Even today, massive swarms of migratory locusts continue to erupt across East Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia, triggered by sudden shifts in regional weather patterns and escalating climate instability. When these modern swarms descend, they instantly threaten the food security of tens of millions of people, demonstrating with absolute clarity that the thin, fragile line separating civilization from starvation has not changed. The invisible army that caddied across Europe in Tambay Bar is not a relic of the past. It is a living, breathing evolutionary force that continues to walk the earth, waiting for the perfect ecological storm to reawaken its insatiable hunger. The ultimate enduring harvest of the year Tambay Mivar is therefore a harvest of profound memory and perpetual vigilance. It reminds us that human progress is not a straight, unassailable line of conquest over the natural world, but rather a continuous, delicate dance of adaptation and humility. True civilizational strength lies not in the arrogant belief that we can completely conquer or control the forces of creation, but in our capacity to deeply understand their complex biological cycles, anticipate our shared vulnerabilities, and stand together across political and social divides when the unexpected shadows fall. The memory of those 72 hours in the summer of Tambay Mibar, preserved through the dedicated ink of terrified medieval monks and validated by the cutting-edge tools of modern bioarchaeology, stands as a permanent, blazing beacon of inspiration across the centuries. It tells us that no matter how sudden the disaster, no matter how absolute the destruction, and no matter how dark and cold the subsequent winter may seem, the human spirit possesses an infinite, beautiful capacity to endure, to clear away the debris of the past, and to plant the precious golden seeds of a brighter tomorrow. To fully map the true colossal scale of the Morcham Nummi Kum character historical epic of the Tambay Mibar locust catastrophe, we must look beyond the immediate agricultural recovery and explore the severe multi-decade geopolitical domino effect that this ecological disaster triggered across Western Europe. A society does not simply suffer a total liquidation of its food supply and emerge unscathed on the global political stage. The severe winter famine of Tambay Bard and Tamchambeitu had quietly hollowed out the structural core of the Carolingian military apparatus. In the 9th century, armies marched, fought and defended fortifications entirely on their bellies. The royal armies of Charles the Bald in West Francia and Louis the German in East Francia relied on a complex feudal logistics system known as the fodrum, a mandatory tax requiring local lands and estates to provide vast quantities of grain, fodder, and livestock to sustain royal troops during military campaigns or prolonged defensive sieges. With the total obliteration of the grain reserves by the infinite insect army, this vital military logistics system completely collapsed, leaving the defences of the empire dangerously exposed to foreign aggression. This systemic military vulnerability became tragically clear just one decade later, culminating in one of the most famous and devastating military crises of the early medieval era, the Great Viking Siege of Paris in Tam Sao. Modern historians have traditionally viewed the Viking incursions as purely political or opportunistic raids driven by Northmen seeking gold and silver. However, when we overlay the environmental data of the Tambay Mibar locust invasion with the timeline of the Viking Wars, a deeper, far more terrifying connection emerges. The generation of young Frankish men who were called upon to man the stone walls of Paris in Tam were the exact same individuals who, as infants and children in Tamchambay Bar, had suffered the acute physical trauma of the Great Winter Famine. As bioarchaeology has proven through the discovery of Harris lines and enamel hypoplasia in 9th century skeletons, this generation grew up with permanently compromised physical development, stunted growth, and reduced physical stamina. The Carolingian Empire was forcing a physically weakened, nutritionally starved generation of conscripts to defend its borders against the robust, well-fed Viking raiders who had bypassed the ecological disaster zone by operating along the unaffected maritime networks of the North Sea. Furthermore, the economic ruin left behind by the Locusts had paralyzed the empire's capacity to build and maintain its defensive infrastructure. In the years immediately preceding Tamtam Bemibar, Charles the Bald had initiated a grand visionary defensive strategy, ordering the construction of fortified bridges, stone watchtowers, and reinforced town walls along the major river networks, specifically the Seine and the Loire, to block the shallow draft Viking longships from penetrating deep into the interior of France. But the sudden erasure of the agricultural surplus completely dried up the royal treasury. The money and manual labour that should have spent the late Tamj completing these cricklestone fortifications had to be entirely redirected toward basic human survival, clearing the toxic, rotting insect debris from the fields and bartering for scarce seed grain from distant lands. Consequently, when a massive fleet of hundreds of Viking longships carrying tens of thousands of Norse warriors sailed up the Seine River in the autumn of Tamtam Yalam, they found the river defences unfinished, undermanned, and structurally fragile. The siege of Paris itself became a long, grueling test of endurance that highlighted the lingering, catastrophic absence of food reserves. When the Viking forces surrounded the island city of Paris, trapping the heroic Count Odo and his small garrison of defenders inside, the primary weapon of the invaders was not a direct, bloody assault on the walls, but rather the slow, agonizing weapon of starvation. Because the regional granaries had never fully recovered their historic pre-Tamtam Bemibar surplus levels, the city of Paris had been unable to stockpile the immense quantities of emergency grain required to sustain a large urban population through a long, multi-month military blockade. Within weeks of the siege commencement, the old, familiar ghost of the Tam Bemibar famine returned to haunt the citizens of Paris. The population was forced to ration their food to microscopic portions, leading to widespread malnutrition, the rapid spread of pestilence within the cramped stone walls, and a complete breakdown of civilian morale. The ultimate resolution of the siege of Paris in Tamtamisau perfectly illustrated the complete, humiliating bankruptcy of Carolingian royal authority that had begun during the Locust invasion. Unable to raise a powerful, well-fed relief army due to the collapse of the feudal logistics system, the Carolingian Emperor Charles the Fat was forced to make a deeply controversial and politically fatal decision. Instead of fighting the Norse invaders, he agreed to pay a massive bribe of hundreds of pounds of silver, and most shockingly, granted the Vikings permission to sail further up the Seine River to plunder the rich, untouched lands of Burgundy. This profound capitulation shattered the final remnants of the population's faith in the Carolingian dynasty. The people realized that their royal protectors were completely powerless to safeguard them from either environmental apocalypses or human invaders. This political vacuum directly accelerated the final permanent fragmentation of Charlemagne's empire, paving the way for the rise of localized feudal principalities, the eventual collapse of the Carolingian line, and the birth of the Capetian dynasty in France. The silent, mechanical jaws of the locust swarm of Tam Bemibar had not just consumed the grain fields, they had systematically chewed through the political and military sinews of an entire empire, altering the map of Western Europe forever. While the macro-geopolitical landscape of Western Europe fractured under the immense weight of the post-Locust economic collapse, the true unfiltered reality of the Tam Bemibar catastrophe was experienced most acutely at the lowest level of the social hierarchy, the small, isolated peasant hamlets scattered across the valleys of France and Germany. To fully understand how a civilization survives a total ecological liquidation, one must look past the royal courts and monastic scriptoriums and step directly into the humble, mud-walled cottages of the early medieval serfs. For these families, the complete erasure of the grain harvest did not just mean an abstract financial crisis or a loss of political prestige. It triggered an immediate, brutal unraveling of their daily survival systems, forcing them to reinvent the very mechanics of their microeconomy in a desperate bid to navigate the dark, unforgiving months of the Great Winter Famine. In a normal, stable agricultural year, the microeconomy of a 9th century village operated on a highly delicate system of mutual aid, communal labour and localised barter networks. Because physical coinage, silver deniers minted by the Carolingian kings, was exceedingly rare and almost entirely confined to wealthy urban merchants, international trade routes and noble tax collectors, the everyday transactions of rural life were conducted entirely through the exchange of goods and services. A blacksmith would repair a ploughshare in exchange for a future portion of a farmer's sluami harvest. A weaver would provide a woolen cloak in exchange for a basket of autumn vegetables. This entire barter network was fundamentally anchored to the absolute, guaranteed reality of the grain supply. Grain was not merely food. It was the baseline currency of the medieval world, the standard unit of value against which all other earthly goods were measured. When the infinite Locust army consumed the fields in just 72 hours, they did not just destroy a food source, completely demonetized the entire rural economy, leaving communities with absolutely no medium of exchange and triggering an immediate chaotic freeze in local commerce. With their primary currency utterly erased, peasant families found themselves trapped in a terrifying microeconomic vacuum where traditional notions of value and property completely dissolved. Items that had once been highly prized as symbols of multi-generational family wealth, such as intricately carved wooden furniture, fine linen sheets, polished bronze cooking pots, and ornamental iron tools, suddenly lost all objective value. In the brutal hierarchy of starvation, a family could not consume a bronze pot or clothe their children in a wooden chest. Conversely, items that were traditionally viewed as completely mundane or worthless suddenly experienced an astronomical, vertical spike in value. A single handful of dried salt, a small jar of animal fat, or a basket of dried acorns became worth more than an entire ancestral plot of land or a collection of high-quality iron tools. Desperate parents would walk for days between neighbouring villages, carrying their most precious family heirlooms on their backs, offering to trade everything they owned to anyone who possessed a hidden, forgotten reserve of organic nutrients. This extreme economic pressure placed an unimaginable strain on the internal social fabric of the medieval village. For centuries, the primary survival mechanism of the European peasantry had been the concept of collective solidarity. Because manual farming was too physically demanding for a single family to execute alone, villages operated as tight-knit collectives, sharing heavy draft animals, pooling their labour to clear fields and maintaining communal pastures. However, as the winter of Tam Baybar deepened and the physical reality of starvation tightened its grip, this ancient system of mutual trust began to fracture under the primal instinct for individual family survival. The village commons, once a space of shared communal harmony, transformed into a tense arena of quiet suspicion. Families began to hoard their few remaining alternative food sources, such as dried roots, wild mushrooms, and small caches of nuts, in deep hidden holes dug beneath the hearthstones of their cottages, carefully concealing their supplies from their closest neighbours and lifelong friends. The collective vulnerability of the community was systematically replaced by a cold, atomized isolation, where every closed door represented a silent battle to see which family could outlast the hunger. Furthermore, this desperate hunt for daily sustenance forced the peasantry into dangerous, direct conflict with the strict, unforgiving legal frameworks of the feudal system. In the No-I-Enote-Hat century, the natural world was heavily compartmentalized by royal and noble decrees. The vast, dense forests that surrounded the agricultural clearings were not free, public spaces. They were the exclusive property of the local lords, counts, and monasteries, strictly reserved for noble hunting parties and managed timber production. The laws governing these seigneurial forests were incredibly harsh, imposing severe physical punishments or astronomical fines on any peasant caught poaching wild deer, wild boars, or even collecting dry wood without explicit aristocratic permission. Yet, when faced with the immediate agonizing cries of their starving children, the peasants realized that the choice between breaking the Lord S law and watching their families perish was no choice at all. This realization triggered a massive clandestine invasion of the European wilderness. Under the dark cover of the winter nights, thousands of desperate farmers slipped silently into the forbidden forests, risking their lives to set simple rope traps for rabbits, hunt small birds, and dig through the frozen snow for acorns and edible bark. This was not a violent, organized rebellion against the nobility, but rather a quiet, relentless micro-rebellion of pure necessity. In many regions, the sheer scale of this desperate trespass overwhelmed the capacity of the lord's foresters and gamekeepers to enforce the law. A single forester could not police thousands of acres of dense woodland against an entire population driven mad by hunger. In a fascinating twist of historical irony, the absolute devastation wrought by an airborne insect plague had forced a conservative, deeply submissive class of serfs to systematically violate the sacred property laws of their rulers, fundamentally altering the power dynamics between the lords and the labourers at the very grassroots level of medieval society. As the grueling winter slowly gave way to the hungry spring of Tamchambaimi II, the microeconomy of desperation reached its absolute zenith. This period, known in agrarian history as the lean months, was traditionally the most challenging part of the calendar year, as the previous winter reserves were exhausted and the new spring crops were still months away from harvest. But in Tamchambaimi II, there were no winter reserves to begin with. The surviving peasants were reduced to a state of absolute biological opportunism. They spent their days scouring the banks of local rivers for freshwater mussels, stripping the toxic but nutrient-bearing roots of wild ferns, and boiling common meadow weeds into thin, tasteless broths. Every hour of daylight was a frantic calculation of expenditure versus caloric return. Yet, it was through these microscopic, unrecorded acts of daily cunning, quiet rule-breaking, and sheer physical endurance that the foundational baseline of European society managed to keep itself alive. They kept the small gears of humanity turning when the great wheels of empires had completely locked, ensuring that when the soil finally thawed, there would still be human hands left to guide the plough. To fully grasp the multi-dimensional complexity of the Tamchambaimi ecological crisis, the historical narrative must shift its focus away from the empty mud cottages of the peasantry and the paralysed royal courts, and look directly behind the massive, fortified stone walls of the great Carolingian monasteries. During the early medieval period, institutions such as the Abbey of Fulda, Saint-Denis, Saint-Germain-des-Prés, and Corbie were not merely isolated centres of quiet contemplation, religious prayer, and the meticulous copying of ancient manuscripts. They operated as the absolute economic, intellectual, and logistical nerve centres of Western Europe, while the surrounding secular world was characterised by extreme decentralisation and fragile wooden architecture. Monasteries were sprawling, self-sustaining stone mini-cities. They controlled vast agricultural estates, managed complex networks of watermills, maintained advanced medicinal herb gardens, and most importantly possessed the deepest, most structurally secure underground stone granaries on the entire continent. Consequently, when the infinite Locust army systematically liquidated the open fields of France and Germany, these monastic complexes instantly transformed into the ultimate high-stakes battlegrounds for human survival and social charity. The primary operational framework that governed these holy institutions was the sacred rule of Saint Benedict, the foundational constitutional document of Western monasticism. Written in the 6th century, the rule placed an absolute non-negotiable spiritual emphasis on the concepts of hospitality and unconditional charity toward the poor, the sick, and the wandering stranger. Chapter Nummi of the rule explicitly dictated that all guests who arrived at the monastery gates must be welcomed precisely as if they were Christ himself, and that the abbot must ensure the poor were provided with food, shelter, and compassion without exception. In normal, bountiful agricultural years, this system of monastic charity functioned beautifully, serving as the primary social safety net of the medieval world. Monasteries routinely distributed surplus grain, baked fresh bread daily for local beggars, and operated rudimentary hospitals for the destitute. However, the unprecedented environmental apocalypse of Tambaimi subjected this ancient spiritual framework to a brutal, agonizing stress test that pushed the structural and moral capacities of the monastic network to their absolute breaking points. When the main body of the Locust swarm finally lifted from the ruined landscapes of East and West Francia in the late summer of Tambay-Mibar, leaving behind a grey, lifeless desert. The roads connecting the major provinces became filled with a tragic, silent migration. Thousands of displaced, starving peasant families, recognizing that their empty village storehouses offered nothing but an immediate death sentence, abandoned their ancestral plots of land and began to walk toward the only places known to possess food, the great monasteries. Within weeks, the majestic stone walls of institutions like Fulda were completely surrounded by a vast, swirling sea of desperate human beings. Modern estimates suggest that camps of refugees numbering in the thousands erected temporary shelters of branches and mud directly outside the abbey gates, creating sprawling, chaotic colonies of misery that looked up to the thick stone bastions for a single glimmer of hope. The air, which had once echoed with the peaceful, rhythmic Gregorian chanting of the monks, was now permanently filled with the collective, heartbreaking cries of starving children and the desperate pleas of mothers begging for a handful of flour. This unprecedented refugee crisis placed a crushing, terrifying moral dilemma directly onto the shoulders of the monastic abbots and their cellarers, the monks responsible for managing the abbey's food reserves. While the monasteries did possess deep underground stone vaults filled with kept grain from previous years, these reserves were highly finite. The locusts had not spared the monastic estates. The vast fields owned by the abbeys had been stripped just as completely as those of the poorest serfs. The monks were looking at a terrifying mathematical reality. Their saved grain reserves, which were originally calculated to comfortably sustain a community of perhaps 200 or 300 monks through the winter, were now being asked to feed tens of thousands of external refugees for an unknown number of months. If the abbot strictly adhered to the literal interpretation of the rule of Saint Benedict and opened the granaries completely to feed every single person outside the walls, the entire reserve would be completely exhausted within a matter of weeks. This would result in the absolute starvation of the monastic community itself, the complete collapse of the spiritual and administrative heart of the kingdom, and the permanent destruction of the institution's capacity to provide any long-term aid. Faced with this existential threat, the great monasteries were forced to rapidly transition from places of open spiritual hospitality into highly disciplined proto-governmental centers of resource management and strict food rationing. The open gate policy of the past was systematically replaced by an intense, highly organized bureaucracy of survival. Monastic cellarers developed meticulous daily calculation systems to stretch their remaining grain supplies as far as humanly possible. Instead of distributing whole loaves of high-quality wheat bread which would consume the reserves too quickly, the monastery kitchens invented what chroniclers referred to as famine gruel, a thin, watery soup made by boiling a minimal amount of coarse rye or oats with wild herbs, tree bark, and large amounts of water to create a voluminous, hot liquid that could artificially fill an empty stomach. The monks laboured from before sunrise until long after sunset, tending to massive bronze cauldrons that boiled non-stop, working to produce enough rationed broth to keep the thousands outside the walls just above the baseline of absolute biological death. This process of managed scarcity required the monks to execute heart-wrenching, pragmatic decisions that left deep psychological scars on the religious communities. Because the volume of refugees far exceeded the daily production capacity of the monastic kitchens, the distribution of the famine gruel had to be strictly prioritized. The cellarers and gatekeepers were forced to establish a harsh hierarchy of charity, favoring children, pregnant women, and the completely infirm, while often turning away able-bodied young men who were deemed more capable of foraging for wild roots in the distant forests. Every afternoon, when the daily ration of broth was completely exhausted, the heavy iron-reinforced oak gates of the monasteries had to be violently swung shut against the weeping crowds. Monks who had taken sacred vows of absolute compassion were forced to stand on the stone ramparts, looking down into the eyes of starving families, telling them that there was simply nothing left to give until the next sunrise. The emotional trauma experienced by the monastic communities was immense, as they found themselves acting not as the gentle hand of a loving deity, but as the rigid clinical managers of human survival. Despite these grim challenges, the role played by the monasteries during the Tamchambeimiba catastrophe permanently altered the structural dynamics of Western European society, accelerating the consolidation of monastic economic and political power over the long term. The peasantry realized that when the secular kings and dukes had completely failed to protect them from the forces of nature, it was the stone walls and the disciplined organization of the church that had kept them alive. In the decades following the Great Recovery of Tambay-mi, an unprecedented wave of gratitude and devotion swept across the countryside. Surviving peasant families who had been saved by monastic gruel dedicated their children to the monasteries as oblates, young boys and girls given to the church to be raised as monks and nuns. Furthermore, landless labourers eagerly signed long-term feudal contracts with the abbeys, willingly placing themselves and their descendants into permanent serfdom under monastic rule in exchange for the guaranteed institutional security of the church stone granaries. The great locust swarm had acted as a brutal, unforgiving crucible that shattered the fragile secular economy, but inside that exact same fire, it had forged the medieval church into an absolutely dominant, indestructible monolith of welfare, land ownership, and social control that would define the historical landscape of Europe for the next 500 years. To fully explore the vast interconnected tapestry of the Tambay-mi-ba environmental crisis, the historical lens must expand beyond human institutions, agricultural economies, and political structures to examine the profound, unrecorded transformation that occurred within the deep wilderness of Western Europe. In the 9th century, the European continent was not the highly developed, fragmented patchwork of urban centres and managed parks that we know today. It was a landscape dominated by immense ancient primordial forests, such as the vast Ardennes, the dense Black Forest, and the sweeping woodland networks of the Frankish heartlands. These deep forests were complex, self-regulating climax ecosystems that had evolved over thousands of years, characterized by towering centuries-old oak and beech trees whose dense upper leaves created a permanent, shadowy green ceiling that completely blocked sunlight from reaching the forest floor. When the infinite vanguard of the locust swarm descended upon these pristine forests on the 3rd day of the invasion, systematically stripping the ancient trees of their foliage and devouring the tough bark of the upper branches, they did not merely cause temporary aesthetic damage. They triggered a sudden, radical environmental shock that completely disrupted the internal mechanics of the wilderness, initiating a massive, decades-long process of ecological recalibration that would permanently alter the biodiversity and structural composition of the European wilderness. The immediate primary consequence of this total forest deforestation was an unprecedented phenomenon known in modern forest ecology as a canopy release event, executed on a continental scale. For centuries, the floor of the ancient European forests had existed in a state of permanent, cool twilight, where the lack of direct solar radiation prevented the growth of diverse undergrowth, leaving the ground covered in nothing but mosses, fungi, and shade-tolerant ferns. But when the billions of chewing mandibles of the locusts stripped the canopy bare in August of Tambay-mi-ba, the green ceiling vanished in a matter of hours. For the first time in generations, the hot, blinding summer sun penetrated directly down to the forest floor, completely illuminating millions of acres of previously dark soil. This sudden, massive influx of solar energy, combined with the extreme saturation of organic nitrates provided by the decomposing bodies of the billions of locusts that died that winter, triggered an explosive, hyper-rapid germination of the long-dormant soil seed bank. The spring of Tamchambeimitu witnessed a surreal, chaotic biological explosion across the ruined woodlands of France and Germany. Species of plants that had spent decades waiting in a state of suspended animation beneath the dark forest floor suddenly burst into life, racing to claim the newly illuminated space. Fast-growing, opportunistic pioneering flora, such as wild brambles, dense thickets of elderberry, raspberries, wild ferns, and aggressive ground vines, carpeted the forest floors in a thick, impenetrable layer of vibrant green. This massive undergrowth explosion was accompanied by the rapid self-seeding of pioneering tree species, most notably silver birch and wild willow, whose light, wind-borne seeds easily colonized the open gaps left by the damaged oaks and beeches. The ancient, orderly climax forests of Charlemagne's era were suddenly transformed into dynamic, chaotic, and highly diverse early succession ecosystems, demonstrating how nature utilizes extreme environmental disruptions to break up biological stagnation and reinvent its own internal structures. This radical restructuring of the plant landscape had an immediate, highly complex domino effect on the wild fauna that inhabited the European interior. For the large woodland mammals, such as the red deer, the roe deer, and the massive wild boars, the immediate aftermath of the Timber swarm had been a period of extreme physical stress, as the loss of leaves and the destruction of the autumn acorn and beech mast crops left them with minimal food resources heading into the winter. However, as the spring of Tambami II arrived and the undergrowth exploded into life, these herbivorous populations found themselves surrounded by an absolute unprecedented paradise of abundant food. The vast fields of wild brambles, fresh green shoots, and nutrient-rich berry bushes provided an endless, easily accessible food supply that far exceeded the sparse forage of the pre-invaded forest. Consequently, the surviving deer and wild boar populations experienced a dramatic, rapid population boom in the mid-Tambami as the abundance of summer nutrients significantly increased juvenile survival rates and deputed the overall reproductive health of the herds. This massive surge in the herbivorous population rapidly triggered a corresponding population expansion among the apex predators of the medieval wilderness, specifically the grey wolf packs that roamed the borders of the Frankish kingdoms. For the wolves, the initial winter famine of Tambami had been a time of opportunistic hunting, as the physically weakened deer and boars were easily tracked and brought down in the deep snow. But as the prey populations exploded in the subsequent years, the wolf packs grew larger, stronger, and increasingly bold. The balance of power within the wilderness was shifting, and the boundaries separating human settlements from the untamable wild became highly volatile. Monastic records from the late Tambami contain numerous references to an unusual increase in wolf activity along the edges of agricultural clearings, as the expanded packs moved along the forest borders, drawn by the scent of domestic livestock and entering into direct, tense competition with human hunters for control of the regional ecosystems. Meanwhile, the avian populations of Western Europe experienced their own unique, fascinating biological disruption. When the locust swarm arrived in the summer of Tambami, it coincided precisely with the critical nesting and post-breeding season for millions of native songbirds, birds of prey, and waterfowl. The sudden violent displacement of the canopy destroyed countless nesting habitats and left birds exposed to the elements. Yet, from a dietary perspective, the infinite swarm represented an absolute, unimaginable glut of pure protein. Avian species that were traditionally flexible in their diets, such as crows, ravens, starlings, and birds of prey, abandoned their normal foraging habits and focused exclusively on consuming the moving walls of insects. Even after the main body of the swarm had departed, the billions of dead locust corpses that littered the landscape provided an inexhaustible high-energy feast that completely altered the natural migration patterns of migratory birds. Ornithological historical data suggests that many migratory species delayed their autumn departures to the south for weeks, lingering in the valleys of France and Germany to gorge themselves on the biological surplus, a behavioral shift that disrupted traditional migratory rhythms for several successive generations. In a fascinating twist of historical irony, this massive, chaotic, ecological recalibration of the wilderness accidentally provided a vital, long-term safety net that helped the human population recover from the Great Winter Famine. When the peasants returned to their cleared fields in the summer of Tambami II, they found that their domestic crops were meagre and slow to mature due to the extreme scarcity of high-quality seed grain. However, when they looked to the edges of the newly illuminated forests, they discovered an absolute abundance of wild resources that had never existed in Etchushat volume before. The explosion of wild berry bushes, edible ferns, and forest mushrooms provided an invaluable natural supplement to the human diet, offering vital vitamins and nutrients that helped stave off the lingering effects of malnutrition. Human survival in the late 9th century became a deeply hybrid endeavor, where families balanced the strict, orderly labor of traditional agriculture with the ancient, opportunistic practices of foraging within a wilderness that was actively rebuilding itself from the ashes of the great insect storm. The story of Tam Bamibar was thus written not just in the neat rows of human wheat fields, but in the untamed, resilient surge of the wild forests, proving that when the delicate structures of civilization are brought to absolute ruin, it is the wild, adaptable energy of nature that provides the ultimate template for rebirth. To fully measure the deep, transformative scope of the Tamcham Bamibar Locust crisis as it echoed across generations, the historical narrative must investigate the profound demographic shifts and structural legal changes that quietly revolutionized the relationship between the medieval ruling elite and the working peasantry. In the early medieval period, the social hierarchy of the Carolingian world was rigidly defined by the system of serfdom, a strict hereditary legal framework that bound the vast majority of the agricultural population directly to the soil they cultivated. Under this system, serfs were not free individuals. They could not leave their villages, choose their professions, or marry without the explicit permission of their local lord. They were locked into an immutable economic contract, forced to provide heavy, unpaid manual labor on the lord's personal estates, known as the corvée, in exchange for a small plot of land to sustain their families and the promise of basic military protection. However, the catastrophic winter famine of Tambay-Mibard in Tamtambay-Mai-2 acted as a brutal, indiscriminate demographic scythe, cutting through the rural population with such immense severity that it permanently altered the fundamental balance of power between those who owned the land and those whose sweat made it fertile. While the exact statistical death toll of the Great Winter Famine remains impossible to calculate using modern census methods, the sweeping socio-economic changes recorded in late 9th century legal documents provide an unmistakable, clear picture of a massive population collapse. When modern historians analyze the polyptychs, the highly detailed, meticulous estate surveys and tax inventories maintained by Carolingian land managers and monastic administrators, they discover a sudden, widespread emergence of a grim administrative term, mansi deserti or deserted holdings. Across the most fertile agricultural districts of France and Germany, hundreds of thousands of peasant cottages and tilled plots stood completely abandoned, their hearths cold and their fields rapidly being reclaimed by wild weeds and forest growth. The families who had tended these lands for generations had either succumbed to the winter hunger or had fled as destitute refugees to the distant stone gates of the monasteries. This sudden, massive disappearance of the human workforce created an unprecedented, catastrophic labor shortage that threatened the entire economic existence of the feudal nobility. In the brutal arithmetic of the medieval agrarian economy, vast tracts of land were entirely worthless without human hands to guide the wooden plows, sow the seed grain, and reap the summer harvests. For the first time since the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the regional counts, dukes, and secular landlords found themselves trapped in a desperate, highly competitive buyer's market for human labor. A lord could possess thousands of acres of pristine, fertile valley soil, but if he lacked the necessary workforce to cultivate it, his estate would produce no food, his revenues would vanish, and his political power within the royal court would completely disintegrate. This extreme economic vulnerability forced the conservative, traditionalist nobility to execute an unimaginable radical shift in their administrative strategies. To lure the surviving, displaced peasant families back onto the Mansi Deserti and convince them to rebuild the ruined agricultural infrastructure, the lords were forced to abandon their traditional coercive legal powers and begin offering unprecedented, highly lucrative economic concessions. The primary manifestation of this economic realignment was the rapid, widespread erosion of hereditary serfdom and the historic birth of free agricultural tenancy. Finding themselves in a position of unexpected, quiet leverage, surviving peasant families began to refuse to accept the rigid, oppressive terms of traditional bondage. If a local lord attempted to enforce the harsh old-world rules of mandatory unpaid corvée labor, the peasants would simply slip away under the cover of night, walking to a neighboring estate where the landlord, desperate for workers, would gladly welcome them with open arms and ask no questions about their past legal status. To combat this widespread flight of labour, lords across West and East Francia began systematically drafting a new kind of legal document, the precarium or the contractual lease. Under these revolutionary new agreements, peasants were no longer treated as property bound to the soil. They were recognized as legally free tenants who voluntarily entered into time-limited, negotiable economic contracts with the landowner. These early medieval tenancy contracts fundamentally revolutionized the daily life of the European peasantry, introducing structural incentives that had been completely absent from the old system of rigid serfdom. Rather than being forced to work the lord's personal fields for free tenants were granted the right to focus their primary labour on their own leased plots, agreeing to pay the landlord a fixed, predictable annual rent consisting either of a specific percentage of their harvested crop or a small set sum of silver coinage. Crucially, any surplus grain, vegetables or livestock that the peasant family managed to produce above the baseline of their fixed rent belonged entirely to them, to be used as they saw fit, stored for future environmental emergencies, or sold for personal profit at local regional markets. This structural transformation completely flipped the psychological framework of medieval farming, replacing the resentful, unmotivated labour of the bound serf with the deeply invested, enterprising energy of the independent tenant farmer who possessed a direct, personal stake in the productivity and resilience of the soil. Furthermore, this demographic realignment triggered a significant, permanent transformation in the physical layout of the European countryside. In the decades before the Tambay-Mibar disaster, peasant hamlets were typically arranged in highly dense, congested clusters immediately surrounding the heavily fortified manor house of the lord, a design optimized for absolute military defense and constant, intrusive noble surveillance. However, as the new system of free tenancy expanded in the late Tambay-Mis and Tamcham-Tammigay, the rural population began to disperse across the landscape, establishing smaller, decentralized homesteads directly in the middle of their leased agricultural plots. The old boundaries of the seigneurial estates were dissolving, replaced by a fluid, dynamic network of independent family farms that were far more adaptable and capable of managing localized environmental challenges. The terrifying 3-day obliteration executed by the Infinite Insect Army had accidentally shattered the rigid, stagnant cage of early medieval social structure, giving birth to a more complex, fluid, and economically dynamic class of rural labourers who carried the foundational seeds of modern European property rights and individual economic freedom directly in their hands. The systemic devastation unleashed by the Great Locust Swarm of Tambay-Mibar did not conclude with the agricultural recovery of Tambay-Mi II or the long-term restructuring of feudal tenancy. In the delicate, interconnected reality of early medieval biology, a massive, continent-wide ecological disruption inevitably triggers a secondary, equally lethal wave of biological consequences: the widespread outbreak of infectious disease and a profound public health crisis. When the multi-layered defenses of human nutrition are completely flattened within 72 hours, the physical body's internal immune architecture is systematically dismantled. The severe, prolonged winter starvation of Tambay-Bar den Tamchambay-Mi II had left the surviving population of France and Germany in a state of absolute physiological vulnerability. This extreme physical weakness, combined with the catastrophic biological pollution of the continental water systems caused by billions of decomposing insect corpses, transformed the Carolingian world into a massive, hyper-reactive incubator for deadly pathogens, forcing a radical, unprecedented revolution in early medical thought, monastic hospitality, and primitive public health management. To fully understand the terrifying mechanics of this secondary crisis, one must first examine the absolute degradation of the medieval water table. As documented in the ecological records of the spring of Tambay-Mi II, the melting winter snows had uncovered infinite rotting carpet of dead locusts that choked the open valleys, shallow wells, and major river networks like the Seine, the Rhine, and the Danube. In the 9th century, the vast majority of rural hamlets and growing urban centres lacked any form of advanced water filtration or centralised sanitation infrastructure. Peasants and townspeople drew their daily drinking, cooking, and washing water directly from local streams or hand-dug communal wells that were completely uninsulated from surface runoff. As the toxic, nitrate-heavy fluids of the decomposing biomass saturated the soil and drained directly into these shared water sources, the vital fluid of life transformed into a stagnant, lethal vector for waterborne illnesses. Within weeks of the spring thaw, sweeping epidemics of acute dysentery, typhoid-like fevers, and severe gastrointestinal infections ripped through the vulnerable populations with an absolute terrifying speed that rivaled the initial insect invasion. However, the most unique and insidious public health hazard of the post-Locust era emerged not from the tainted water, but from the desperate experimental methods used by the peasantry to cultivate alternative food sources. As detailed previously, the acute scarcity of high-quality wheat and barley seeds had forced farmers to rely heavily on planting rugged, damp-resistant alternative grains, specifically rye. Rye was exceptionally durable and capable of thriving in the scarred, nutrient-disrupted soil left behind by the swarm. But the spring and summer of Tamjambemi II were characterized by unusual, highly humid weather patterns, an atmospheric byproduct of the broader regional climate shifts affecting the continent. This intense, persistent moisture, combined with the weakened, unmanaged state of the newly tilled fields, created the absolute perfect environmental conditions for the rapid, widespread proliferation of a parasitic plant fungus known to modern science as Claviceps purpurea or ergot. When ergot infects a field of rye, it systematically replaces the healthy, nutrient-rich grains of the plant with dark, purplish, horn-like fungal masses called sclerotia. To the hungry, desperate medieval peasant who lacked any understanding of microscopic botany or fungal toxicity, these strange, dark grains appeared to be a completely harmless natural variation of the crop. Facing the immediate threat of starvation, families eagerly harvested the infected rye, ground it into a coarse flour using local water mills, and baked it into heavy, dark loaves of survival bread. This innocent act of consumption unleashed a horrific, widespread neurological and physiological epidemic known in medieval chronicles as ignis sacer, the sacred fire, or what modern medicine defines as ergotism. The consumption of the ergot-tainted bread introduced highly toxic alkaloids directly into the human bloodstream, triggering a devastating systemic reaction. The toxins caused acute vasoconstriction, severely restricting blood flow to the extremities of the body. Victims experienced a persistent, agonizing burning sensation in their hands and feet, feeling as though their limbs were being held directly over open flames. In severe, prolonged cases, the lack of oxygenated blood led to dry gangrene, causing the flesh of the fingers and toes to wither and separate cleanly from the bone without blood loss, a clinical manifestation that horrified medieval onlookers. Most terrifyingly, the ergot alkaloids acted as powerful hallucinogens, inducing severe central nervous system disruptions, violent muscle spasms, permanent blindness, and vivid, terrifying visual and auditory hallucinations that many mistook for literal demonic possession or apocalyptic visions. The sacred fire swept through entire villages simultaneously, incapacitating the vital farming workforce at the exact moment when the agricultural recovery required non-stop, intense manual labor. This immense, multi-layered healthcare catastrophe completely overwhelmed the traditional, highly rudimentary medical systems of the 9th century. Before the Tambemibar disaster, early medieval medicine was an unorganized, highly localized mix of ancient Galenic humorism, superstitious folk remedies, and spiritual incantations managed by local village-wise women or monastic herbalists. Faced with thousands of citizens simultaneously collapsing from toxic waterborne infections and the hallucinatory horrors of ergotism, the old decentralized methods proved entirely useless. The sheer, overwhelming volume of human misery forced the intellectual elite within the great Carolingian monasteries to rapidly strip away the layers of superstition and initiate a disciplined, systematic revolution in medical documentation, clinical observation, and public health infrastructure. The primary epicenter of this intellectual medical awakening was the monastic infirmaria, the specialized hospital wings located within the quiet inner courtyards of the abbeys. Under the intense pressure of the Tambemibar-Tambemi II crisis, Abbots systematically ordered the expansion of these infirmaries, transitioning them from small, quiet spaces meant only for aging monks into massive, highly organized public triage centers. Monastic scholars began compiling extensive, highly detailed medical manuals known as herbaria or leech books. Rather than relying on abstract, theoretical Latin texts imported from the distant past, monks began engaging in direct clinical experimentation, systematically documenting which specific native European herbs and plants possessed the exact chemical properties required to counteract the symptoms of the epidemics. Through this intense trial by fire research, monastic medical gardens underwent a rapid expansion. Monks discovered that brewing concentrated teas from the bark of the willow tree, which contains salicylic acid, the active precursor to modern aspirin, could effectively reduce the burning fevers associated with the waterborne plagues. They cultivated vast plots of mint, fennel, and chamomile to soothe the hyperreactive digestive tracts of dysentery victims, and utilized natural anti-inflammatory poultices made from crushed wild garlic and honey to clean and protect the necrotic tissue of ergotism sufferers from secondary bacterial infections. The physical monastery was evolving from a purely spiritual fortress into a highly advanced, empirical center of pharmaceutical production and clinical care, fundamentally elevating the status of medicine within the hierarchy of medieval knowledge. Furthermore, this prolonged public health crisis triggered the very first systemic understanding of the critical connection between environmental sanitation and human disease prevention. Monastic architects and master builders, observing that the abbeys drawing water from deep protected stone conduits remained entirely free from the dysentery epidemics plaguing villages using open surface streams, began designing revolutionary, highly advanced hydraulic systems for their complexes. They initiated the construction of segregated water networks, utilizing hollowed-out oak logs or lead pipes, to transport clean, pristine spring water directly from Hat mountain sources straight into the monastery kitchens and infirmaries. Simultaneously, they engineered separate, stone-lined subterranean drainage trenches designed to carry wastewater, animal refuse, and latrine runoff away from the living quarters and safely downstream, entirely separate from the drinking supply. This structural segregation of water systems, accelerated directly by the terrifying biological lessons of the Tamchem-Bemibar locust invasion, represented the foundational dawn of modern public health engineering, carving a permanent line of defense that would eventually lift the entire European continent out of the dark ages of systemic pestilence and into a safer, more sanitary future. The far-reaching shockwaves of the great locust swarm of Tam-Bemibar did not stop at reshaping agricultural policies, feudal tenancy structures, or monastic public health systems. They penetrated deep into the intellectual centers of the Carolingian Renaissance, completely altering the trajectory of early medieval natural philosophy and scientific inquiry. In the decades preceding the ecological catastrophe, the intellectual elite of West and East Francia concentrated around the prestigious palace schools established by Charlemagne and expanded by his grandsons, Charles the Bald and Louis the German, were deeply preoccupied with a highly specific abstract revival of classical learning. Scholars from across the Christian world, including Irish theologians like John Scotus Erugena and Frankish canonists like Hincmar of Reims, spent their lives harmonizing Christian theology with Neoplatonic philosophy, mastering Latin grammar, and debating complex ecclesiastical laws. The material world, with its unpredictable weather systems and biological fluctuations, was often dismissed as a secondary, fallen realm of existence, unworthy of systematic empirical study. However, the absolute 72-hour liquidation of the continent's agricultural foundation forced these court intellectuals to suddenly descend from their abstract theological towers and confront the physical mechanics of the natural world with a raw, unprecedented intensity. Before the disaster of Tam-Bemibar, the prevailing intellectual framework used to explain unusual natural phenomena was known as prodigia, the belief that earthquakes, eclipses, and comets were isolated, miraculous interventions by a divine creator, operating entirely outside the laws of nature to signal political change or royal doom. When the infinite insect army blotted out the sun at midday, the initial reaction of the court scholars was to interpret the event through this traditional supernatural lens, searching the scriptures for apocalyptic warnings. But as the winter famine deepened and the structural collapse of the empire's economy became an undeniable reality, this purely passive, allegorical approach proved entirely insufficient to meet the practical challenges of statecraft. The kings required practical solutions to rebuild their tax bases, local counts needed methods to restore order among starving populations, and monastic managers demanded strategies to prevent future agricultural failures. This urgent systemic necessity triggered a profound epistemological transformation, forcing early medieval thinkers to shift their focus away from viewing nature as a mere canvas for divine whims and begin examining it as an objective, interconnected system governed by its own internal laws and physical causes. The primary architect of this intellectual realignment was the powerful and highly influential Archbishop of Reims, Hincmar. Standing as the chief political advisor to Charles the Bald and the most formidable legal mind of the West Frankish kingdom, Hincmar recognized that the total collapse of the agricultural infrastructure required a systematic administrative and intellectual response. In the immediate wake of the famine of Tambay II, Hincmar issued a series of revolutionary pastoral letters and administrative treatises that altered how the Carolingian state viewed environmental crises. Rather than simply instructing the population to fast and pray, Hincmar argued that human society possessed a distinct moral responsibility to actively study the signa naturae, the signs of nature, to anticipate, mitigate, and adapt to ecological shifts. He began organizing a massive, kingdom-wide effort to collect, synthesize, and archive localized environmental observations, instructing regional bishops and counts to maintain detailed records of seasonal temperatures, rainfall anomalies, and insect movements. This represented the foundational dawn of systematic data collection in post-Roman Europe, transforming the practice of record-keeping from a collection of isolated monastic memories into a crude but highly effective tool for predictive environmental analysis. This intellectual shift rapidly manifested in a profound continent-wide revival of classical Roman agronomy and natural history within the monastic scriptoriums. For centuries, the highly advanced agricultural and scientific treatises written by ancient Roman authorities, such as Cato the Elder, Varro, Columella, and Palladius, had sat forgotten and heavily dusted on the highest shelves of monastic libraries, viewed by early Christian copyists as pagan texts of minimal relevance to spiritual salvation. But under the intense pressure of the post-Locust recovery, abbots across France and Germany issued urgent orders to their scribes to locate, clean, translate, and systematically copy these ancient manuscripts. Scriptoriums from St. Gall to Corbie transformed into frantic workshops dedicated to the mass production of practical agrarian knowledge. Monks meticulously studied Roman techniques of soil management, crop rotation, and advanced irrigation, copying the texts with a disciplined precision that had previously been reserved only for the Holy Scriptures. The physical integration of these classical Roman texts into the intellectual curriculum of the medieval church led directly to the birth of a more sophisticated empirical form of medieval agronomy. Monastic land managers began actively testing the theories of Columella and Palladius in the field, experimenting with different depths of tilling, analyzing the chemical benefits of mixing animal manure verkepite hat river silt to restore the nutrient-depleted soil left behind by the swarm, and engineering advanced terracing systems along hillsides to maximize water retention during dry seasons. The elite thinkers of the era were bridging the vast gap that had traditionally separated abstract, bookish scholarship from the raw manual labor of the fields. They were realizing that the preservation of Christian civilization required an active empirical engagement with the earth, transforming the monk from a passive recorder of historical tragedies into an active scientist of ecological survival. Moreover, this intellectual awakening fundamentally altered the development of medieval language, literature, and art. In the decades following Tambay Mibar, the vocabulary used by monastic chroniclers to describe the natural world underwent a noticeable evolution. The highly emotional, apocalyptic language of the initial invasion slowly gave way to a more clinical, observant terminology. Scribes began using specific descriptive Latin words to categorize different species of insects, detail their life cycles, and track their migration routes across geographic barriers like rivers and mountains. In the illuminated manuscripts produced during the late Noe-Natehat century, the depiction of the natural world shifted away from abstract, highly stylized religious symbols toward a more realistic observational style. Artists began sketching intricate, lifelike representations of common birds and forest plants in the margins of liturgical texts, a visual manifestation of a society that was learning to look at the details of its environment with a renewed sense of wonder, respect, and scientific curiosity. The mechanical jaws of the Great Swarm had broken the intellectual stagnation of the Carolingian world, forcing a generation of scholars to open their eyes to the complex, beautiful, and volatile mechanics of the earth, and ensuring that the harvest of their minds would remain resilient against any future ecological storm. The profound intellectual and philosophical shifts that swept through the Carolingian Renaissance in the wake of the Tam-Bamibar Locust catastrophe did not remain confined to the parchment pages of monastic libraries. They materialized directly into the physical landscape of Western Europe, triggering a radical, multi-generational revolution in rural architecture, engineering, and the structural organization of medieval settlements. Before the catastrophic summer of Tam-Bamibar, the physical infrastructure of agricultural processing and grain storage across France and Germany was dangerously primitive, decentralized, and fragile. The vast majority of peasant communities relied on temporary wooden granaries or rudimentary underground storage pits dug directly into the soil, which were highly vulnerable to moisture, rot, rodent infestations, and the sudden devastating cancay of airborne pests. When the Infinite Insect Army liquidated the continent's food supply in just 72 hours, they exposed the absolute fatal vulnerability of this decentralized wooden infrastructure. In response, the ruling nobility and monastic networks initiated a massive, coordinated transition towards stone-based defensive architecture, creating a highly centralized and fortified network of grain processing that would permanently alter the spatial geography and legal structure of the European countryside. To fully comprehend this structural transformation, one must first examine the radical redesign of the traditional medieval granary, a building known in Latin architectural texts as the Horium. Observing that the locusts had easily chewed through the straw-thatched roofs and thin wooden walls of traditional storehouses, monastic architects engineered a highly advanced fortress-like storage structure designed specifically to withstand severe environmental shocks. These new granaries were constructed entirely of thick dressed limestone blocks, featuring heavy slate or clay-tiled roofs that were entirely impervious to boring insects. Crucially, the buildings were elevated completely off the ground, supported by a series of specialized stone pillars known as staddle stones. These pillars featured wide, mushroom-like caps that effectively blocked crawling insects, rodents, and moisture from ascending into the main storage chambers. The interior of the Horium was meticulously partitioned into deep, well-ventilated stone bins lined with lime plaster, an antimicrobial material that naturally absorbed excess moisture and prevented the proliferation of fungal molds like ergot. The granary was no longer a simple barn. It had evolved into a highly engineered, climate-controlled vault designed to safeguard the lifeblood of the community against the unpredictable forces of nature. However, this architectural revolution extended far beyond the walls of the storehouses, leading directly to a profound permanent consolidation of aristocratic economic power through the enforcement of the banum, the absolute, legal monopoly of the feudal lord over the essential infrastructure of food production. Before the Tam-Bamibar disaster, many peasant families operated small, hand-powered stone mills within their own cottages, grinding their hard-won grain into flour independently and baking their bread in primitive localized earthen ovens. While this decentralized system granted the peasantry a high degree of daily autonomy, it was hopelessly inefficient and structurally defenseless during a systemic ecological crisis. Recognizing that the preservation of the scarce, invaluable post-famine seed grain required absolute administrative oversight, regional counts and landlords systematically outlawed the use of private hand mills and domestic ovens, declaring a strict, non-negotiable royal monopoly over the mechanics of food processing. Under this powerful new legal framework, lords across West and East Francia invested vast sums of capital to construct massive, highly advanced and heavily fortified communal facilities, the Moulin Banal, the seigneurial watermill, and the Four Banal, the lordly communal oven. Built of solid, fireproof stone and often positioned immediately adjacent to the fortified manor house or monastery walls, these centralized facilities were managed by specialized lordly officials who strictly regulated every single stage of the food production process. Peasants across the entire district were legally compelled to bring their harvested grain exclusively to the lordess watermill to be ground into flour, and their dough exclusively to the lordess communal oven to be baked into bread. The traditional independent domestic labor of the peasant household was systematically dismantled, replaced by a highly clinical, institutionalized production line operating under the direct, watchful eye of the feudal state. To compensate the lord for the immense capital expenditure required to build and maintain these advanced stone structures, the peasantry was required to pay a mandatory, non-negotiable tax known as banalités. This fee typically consisted of a specific fixed percentage of the grain or flour processed within the facility, usually 1/16 or 1/24 of the total volume. To modernize, this system appears highly exploitative, a ruthless mechanism designed to extract the maximum amount of wealth from a struggling labor class. However, when viewed through the desperate, high-stakes lens of the late 9th century, the rise of the Banum was accepted by the population as a vital, life-saving institutional necessity. The centralized stone mill and communal oven provided a level of structural security and processing efficiency that no individual peasant family could ever hope to achieve alone. The high-capacity stone ovens, fired continuously using managed timber resources, baked bread at uniform, sterile temperatures that significantly reduced the risk of ergot contamination, while the fortified stone walls of the mill protected the community as precious flour reserves from sudden local raids or environmental contamination. This legal and economic centralization fundamentally remolded the physical layout and social life of the European village, creating the classic medieval settlement pattern that would endure for centuries. Because peasants were required to visit the seigneurial mill and communal oven on a weekly basis, the residential cottages began to cluster tightly around these massive stone landmarks, abandoning the scattered, isolated homestead designs of the early 9th century. The mill race, the engineered canal that directed water to the heavy timber wheels of the Lord S. Mill, became the geographic and social heart of the community, a bustling public space where independent tenant farmers from across the district gathered to exchange news, barter goods, and discuss agricultural strategies while waiting for their grain to be processed. The mechanical clicking of the mill gears and the warm, comforting aroma of baking bread radiating from the massive stone ovens replaced the old, quiet isolation of the rural landscape. Out of the absolute ruin of an insect invasion, the feudal nobility and the resilient peasantry had co-authored a more structured, resilient, and technologically advanced landscape, binding the daily survival of the individual directly to the permanent stone infrastructure of the community. The multi-generational ripples of the Tamcham-Beba Locust catastrophe did not merely alter the legal, architectural, or public health systems of Western Europe. They penetrated the most intimate daily ritual of human life, the preparation and consumption of food. Before the infinite insect army systematically liquidated the fields of East and West Francia, the dietary habits of the Carolingian world were rigidly divided by social class and dictated by a fragile reliance on a few core agricultural products. The wealthy aristocratic elites and high-ranking church officials consumed fine, heavily sifted white wheat bread, large quantities of roasted fresh meat from domestic cattle, and imported wines, viewing their rich diet as a direct reflection of their divinely ordained status. In contrast, the peasant majority subsisted on a monotonous regimen of thick barley porridge, dark rye bread, and seasonal dairy products. However, the 72-hour erasure of the continental vegetation completely disrupted this food hierarchy, triggering a profound long-term crisis in food preservation, livestock management, and culinary engineering that fundamentally revolutionized the dietary culture and traditional cuisines of Western Europe for centuries to come. To fully understand this culinary evolution, one must first examine the immediate catastrophic collapse of the medieval livestock infrastructure that followed the invasion. The locusts did not merely consume the domestic crops meant for human consumption, they devoured every single blade of grass across the communal pastures, meadowlands, and river valleys, leaving the earth looking like a barren grey desert. In the 9th century, animal husbandry was entirely dependent on the availability of these natural grazing lands and the collection of summer hay to sustain livestock through the winter months. With the absolute destruction of the pasture lands, millions of domestic cattle, sheep and goats were suddenly left with absolutely no source of fodder. Peat logs and monastic estate surveys from the autumn of Tambemeba record an unprecedented desperate phenomenon, the mass emergency culling of domestic herds. Realizing that their animals would inevitably starve to death as the first winter frosts arrived, peasants and lords alike were forced to slaughter a massive percentage of their livestock simultaneously. This sudden, massive slaughter created a profound and highly volatile paradox within the medieval food economy. For a brief agonizing window of a few weeks in late Tambemeba, there was a massive unnatural surplus of fresh meat across the Carolingian kingdoms. However, this surplus was a cruel illusion. In an era completely devoid of artificial refrigeration, fresh meat spoils within days, transforming into a toxic vector for lethal bacterial contamination. To prevent this invaluable mountain of animal protein from rotting into absolute waste, communities had to engage in a frantic, continent-wide effort to preserve the meat using primitive chemical techniques. The primary, most critical commodity required for this preservation was common salt, which naturally draws moisture out of animal tissue and prevents the proliferation of putrefying microorganisms. This desperate demand for preservation triggered an unprecedented economic boom along the coastal salt pans of western France and the inland brine springs of Germany, as salt suddenly became more valuable than silver coinage. Millions of pounds of beef, pork and mutton were meticulously sliced, packed into heavy oak barrels between dense layers of coarse salt, or hung in specialized communal smokehouses to create dry, heavily salted hams and jerked meats that could safely resist spoilage for months or even years. This intense reliance on preserved meats permanently transformed the European palate. Even after the agricultural recovery of the late Tambemeba, heavily salted, smoked and brined meats remained the absolute cornerstone of the continental diet, establishing a flavor profile that would dominate traditional European charcuterie and winter cuisines for the next millennium. Simultaneously, the temporary loss of domestic cattle herds forced a radical, permanent revolution in the production and technology of European dairy preservation. Before the locust invasion, liquid cow's milk was a common seasonal beverage consumed quickly within rural households, or turned into soft, highly perishable fresh cheeses that could not travel long distances. But with the drastic reduction in cattle numbers and the acute need for highly concentrated, transportable and long-lasting sources of protein, monastic agriculturalists systematically shifted their focus toward advanced, hard cheese production. Utilizing sheep and goat herds which were far more resilient and capable of foraging on the rugged undergrowth and wild brambles that exploded across the landscape in Tambemeba, monks began perfecting the science of long-matured, pressed hard cheeses by using natural animal rennet to curdle the milk, pressing the curds into heavy wooden molds to extract every drop of moisture, and bathing the resulting cheese wheels in dense salt brines. The monasteries engineered a revolutionary food product, a highly dense, indestructible block of pure fat and protein that could sit on a wooden shelf for years without degrading, completely immune to the boring mandibles of insects or the damp rot of winter storage. These advanced cheese-making techniques rapidly spread from the monastic enclosures to the free tenant farms, giving birth to the classic, world-renowned regional varieties of hard and semi-hard European cheeses that continue to define the agricultural heritage of France, Germany and Switzerland today. The cheese wheel was no longer just a simple farmhouse snack. It had been elevated into a critical strategic survival asset, a portable financial currency, and a foundational pillar of the European dietary landscape. Moreover, the prolonged trauma of the Great Winter Famine forced a permanent, highly significant democratization of the European culinary menu, elevating humble famine foods into celebrated staples of regional cuisine. Before Tambay Bar, vegetables that develop beneath the soil, such as turnips, parsnips, garlic onions, and wild radishes, were viewed by the cultural elite with immense disdain, considered coarse, unclean foods fit only for the lowest class of landless labourers or domestic swine. This dietary prejudice was rooted in a bizarre medieval philosophical concept known as the Great Chain of Being, which dictated that foods growing closest to the heavens, such as tree-borne fruits and tall stalks of wheat, were inherently noble and spiritually pure, while foods buried in the dark earth were naturally base, heavy, and spiritually corrupting. But when the infinite insect army proved that the noble wheat stalks could be utterly erased in 72 hours, while the subterranean root vegetables remained completely untouched and safely insulated beneath the soil, this rigid food hierarchy collapsed under the weight of pure survival necessity. To protect themselves from future famines, both peasants and aristocrats began aggressively cultivating vast plots of root vegetables, alongside rugged, cold-resistant leafy greens like kale and cabbage, and high-protein legumes such as field peas and lentils. These resilient crops were systematically integrated into the daily diet, giving birth to the iconic, universal cornerstone of traditional European home cooking, the pottage or the perpetual stew. The pottage was a culinary masterpiece of pure economic efficiency and resource conservation. Operating continuously over a slow, permanent hearth fire, a massive iron cauldron was kept filled at a simmering dense broth of water, wild herbs, and whatever root vegetables, peas, or small scraps of salted meat were available. As contents were consumed, new ingredients were continuously added to the pot, allowing the broth to develop a deep, rich complexity over weeks and months without ever being fully emptied. This cooking method required minimal firewood, utilized every single scrap of organic material right down to the peelings, and naturally sterilized the food through continuous boiling, providing a safe, hot, and highly nutritious meal that sustained families through the coldest winter months. The pottage erased the old, fragile reliance on bread alone, creating a more diverse, nutrient-rich, and complex dietary culture that significantly improved the overall health, life expectancy, and physical resilience of the European population over the long term. Out of the absolute ruin of their golden grain fields, the people of the Carolingian world had completely re-engineered their relationship with the products of the earth, proving that true culinary genius is Bao Ro No, not in the lavish kitchens of stable empires, but in the desperate, creative fires of a society learning to harvest survival from the very depths of scarcity. Ultimately, the epic saga of the great locust swarm of Tambay Bar leaves us with a profound, unassailable truth. Human history is not merely a chronicle of kings, empires, or the violent clashes of human armies. It is an intricate, deeply volatile dance between human civilization and the living, breathing ecosystem of the planet Earth. The 72-hour ecological invasion that paralyzed the Carolingian world did not just test the physical bodies of those who lived through it, it served as a brutal, unforgiving crucible that permanently broke the stagnant early medieval status quo and forced a complete, revolutionary rebuilding of Western European society. From the empty fields of ruined grain rose a new world of crop diversification and free agricultural tenancy, replacing the rigid, unmotivated chains of traditional serfdom with the enterprising, resilient energy of independent farmers. Out of the toxic biological pollution of the water tables emerged a massive revolution in public health engineering and clinical monastic medicine. And from the ash-grey remnants of thatched roof barns, a majestic new landscape of elevated stone granaries and centralized watermills was born, physically reshaping the geography and social structures of European villages for the next 1,000 years. The silent mechanical jaws of the insect army had accidentally acted as a powerful catalyst for human advancement, demonstrating that true civilizational resilience is forged not in the moments of comfortable stability, but in the dark, desperate fires of survival. The people of the 9th century possessed no advanced scientific vocabulary to explain the serotonergic metamorphosis of the pests, nor did they have automated technology to recover their losses. Yet they possessed an unyielding, indestructible strength of spirit. They looked at a monochromatic, barren landscape of ruin and found the creative courage to adapt, innovate, and reconstruct their civilization from absolute zero, ensuring that the flame of human progress would continue to burn brightly through the darkest ecological storms. As we bring this monumental chapter of history to its close, we want to extend our deepest gratitude to you for journeying with us through this extraordinary testament to human endurance. If this immersive deep dive into history's most dramatic and forgotten ecological catastrophe has captivated your mind and inspired your spirit, please take a final moment to fully support our platform. Smash that subscribe button right now, give this video a massive thumbs up, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another epic historical narrative. We want to hear your voice, so please leave a detailed comment below sharing your profound thoughts on the resilience of the Carolingian people, or tell us hat a forgotten historical mystery you want us to unearth next. Share this video with fellow history enthusiasts, friends, and family to help our community grow. Thank you for watching. Stand strong against your own storms, and we will see you in the next epic chapter of history. Channel is a storytelling platform created for entertainment, inspiration, education, and the promotion of relaxation and peaceful sleep. All stories presented on this channel are global historical tales gently curated and narrated based on themes such as the rise and fall of nations' human cultures and extraordinary journeys through time.